Today's podcast features 3 stories that involve people who were trapped with no way out. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The 15th Floor, and it's about something truly disturbing that's found in an apartment building in China. The second story you'll hear is called Rabbit Hole, and it's about a hunter who sees something on the ground and goes in for a closer look. And the third and final story you'll hear is called My Brother's Keeper, and it's about a very famous street that has a very dark history. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer the Amazon Music follow button a nice bag of chips, but be sure you crush the entire bag first. Okay, let's get into our first story called The 15th Floor. By the beginning of 2016, everybody who lived in apartment building number 12 on Shanxi Road in the big Chinese city of Xi'an knew to stay away from the woman who lived at the end of the hall on the 15th floor. Now, they didn't know much about this woman, but what they did know about her was totally bizarre and kind of alarming. The woman, whose family name was Wu, but nobody actually knew this woman's individual name, was 43 years old and she lived alone. And from what residents could tell, nobody ever came to visit her, and she almost never left her apartment. But oftentimes, residents on the 15th floor could hear this woman talking to herself very animatedly inside of her apartment, and sometimes she'd even get into these big arguments with herself, where it was clear she was kind of playing the role of multiple personalities at once. But none of these things were the reason why people avoided her altogether. They avoided her because she seemed really dangerous. One day, a few months earlier, a teenage girl was walking down the hallway on the 15th floor, making her way towards her friend's apartment, when she passed by this woman's apartment door. And as soon as she walked past, the door to this woman's apartment flew open, and the woman rushed outside and began screaming incoherently. And so this teenage girl, she whips around and sees this woman, and instinctively, what this girl thought was, oh my goodness, this woman is being attacked. She's running away from somebody in her apartment or something. But then very quickly, it became apparent that this woman was not being attacked. She was attacking the teenage girl. So this woman, she looks at the girl and her eyes go wide and she kind of curls her hands into claws. And then she began running down the hall towards this girl. And so the girl, she begins to scream and she turns and she runs down the hall and she manages to pound on her friend's door. And her friend happened to be right behind the door. They opened it up, the girl ran inside, and they shut and locked the door right as this woman came barreling into the door. And this behavior from this woman on the 15th floor was just the beginning. Following this first attack, the woman on the 15th floor would routinely barge out of her apartment and chase down young women and teenage girls that were walking past her door. Now, this woman never actually hurt anyone that she chased down and even reached in time. She just kind of scared them. And so as a result, the residents of this apartment building, including the women and young girls who had been attacked by this woman, their reaction to this was not anger or resentment or, some desire to go call the police and have this woman arrested. Instead, the residents of this building just kind of felt bad for this woman. It seemed very obvious that she was mentally unwell and probably very lonely, and so they kind of collectively decided to not call the police and instead just kind of ignore her. But sometime in early February, this woman's random attacks on young women and girls just kind of stopped. And at first, residents, especially of the 15th floor of this apartment building, were just relieved because all of a sudden you could walk down that hallway in peace again. But by the end of February, it dawned on people who lived in this apartment building that not only had this woman stopped her random attacks, but also now they couldn't even hear her inside of her apartment talking to herself because that was something people always heard, and now her apartment was totally silent. And so pretty quickly, people became kind of worried about this woman. But nobody was willing to go knock on her door and actually make sure she was okay, because again, this woman was viewed as being kind of dangerous. I mean, she was literally jumping out of her apartment and attacking random passerbys, and so people just continued to keep their distance from this woman. And so as people did that, they began to tell themselves that, probably she just moved out without anybody noticing, and that's why she's gone quiet. But it would turn out that was not the case. Right around the time the woman on the 15th floor stopped her attacks and went silent sometime in early February, an elevator inside of this apartment building broke down between floors 11 and 10. And so a maintenance crew was called out to fix the elevator, but when they got there, they realized they didn't have the supplies or the manpower to actually make the fix, and so a decision was made to just cut the power to this individual elevator car, and then the work crew said they'd come back in about a month when they had the right supplies and people. And sure enough, a month later, this crew came back with what they needed, and they were able to lower the broken elevator car down to floor 10, and then they opened up the doors, and they were absolutely horrified at what they saw inside of that car. It's believed that shortly after this woman on the 15th floor had one of her outbreaks and chased someone down the hall, she got into the elevator and began traveling down. And when the elevator car got between floors 11 and 10, it came to a lurching stop. But for some reason, when this happened, the woman did nothing. She didn't yell for help, she didn't scream, she didn't pound on the doors, she didn't press any buttons. She just sat in the elevator car in absolute silence. And so eventually it was discovered that one of the elevator cars in this apartment building was broken, not because the woman had called out, but probably because someone had tried to hail the elevator and it didn't come down. And so that maintenance crew was called out, but they couldn't make the repair, and so they decided to cut the power to that car and come back in a month. Now, this elevator crew had no idea there was anybody inside the elevator car because, again, this woman who was trapped in there was totally silent throughout their attempts to try to fix the car. And so after these workers cut the power to this elevator car and left, this woman was doomed. This woman just sat in silence in this elevator car with no food and no water for several days until she died of dehydration, which is one of the most agonizing and slow ways to go. Now, at some point, this woman did attempt to free herself because there were scratch marks inside the elevator indicating that she had tried to claw her way out, and her hands were totally mutilated, suggesting she really had been clawing pretty hard, but that was the only time she tried to save herself. Otherwise, she just sat there and eventually died. Our next story is called Rabbit Hole. On January 1st, 2015, a family in South Yorkshire, England, gathered at a restaurant for their annual New Year's Day lunch. But one member of this family who said they would be attending didn't show up. It was 50-year-old Stephen Winfrey, who was an unemployed, divorced father of two, who in recent years had become quite depressed. When they reached out to him on his phone and he didn't pick up, the family pretty quickly started to worry that something could have happened to him, that, perhaps he did something to harm himself given his mental state. But his sister, Nadine, who was at this lunch, she reassured the rest of the family that she had spoken to Stephen the night before, and he was in great spirits and had told her that his plan was to go rabbit hunting the next day on New Year's Day before heading over to the restaurant for lunch. And because Nadine knew that her brother recently had really taken a liking to rabbit hunting, it was one of the very few things that actually made him happy, she told the family, look, I bet you anything he just lost track of time and he will get here late, or maybe we won't see him at all, but at least he's out doing something that makes him happy. And so the family was reassured by this, and so they sat down at their table, they ordered their food, and the whole meal, everyone's kind of looking over at the front door, expecting Stephen to come strolling in at any minute. But when they finished up eating, he still had not arrived. And so as the family was getting ready to leave the restaurant and head back home, they all decided that, you know what, I'm sure Stephen is fine. He's doing something he loves. I'm sure he did just get carried away. And so we'll just wait for him to contact us. And so the family, they all leave the restaurant and they spend the rest of the day at their respective households. And then the following morning, they all get in touch with each other and they discover that still no one has seen or heard from Stephen. And so at this point, the family just felt like there was something off about this, and so they contacted the police and they reported him missing. As the police were getting ready to head out and begin looking for Stephen that day, they received a call. Stephen had been found. Although the exact details of what happened to Stephen may never be fully understood, this is the best theory that the police have come up with. On New Year's Day, January 1st, the day Stephen was supposed to meet his family for lunch, he had gotten up early and headed out to a nearby forested park to do some rabbit hunting, just like he told his sister he would be. He had gone to the park with his dog and some ferrets. The way Stephen caught rabbits is he would release these ferrets into various rabbit holes, and then he would stand back with his rifle and he would wait for the ferret to run the rabbits out of their holes, out into the open, and then he would raise his rifle and shoot at the rabbits, and then his dog would run over and grab the rabbit and bring it back to him. And so all morning long, he was doing this with relative success, and then something happened to where Stephen decided he needed to actually look inside of one of these rabbit holes. Perhaps one of his ferrets got stuck or one of the rabbits got stuck, but either way, he wanted to look into the opening of one of these rabbit holes. And so he walked over to it, and apparently he couldn't quite see whatever it was he wanted to see. And so he got down on his hands and knees and stuck his head into this rabbit hole opening. Now, these openings to these rabbit holes are pretty narrow, and so once he forced his head inside, it got stuck. He could not pull it out again. And so all around the outside of this hole where his head was stuck, there were these deep divots that his hands had obviously dug once he realized he was stuck, because he was trying to dig the entrance a little bit wider to get his head out. But as he was working really, really hard and laboring to kind of dig this hole out, he was burning up the very limited amount of oxygen that was inside of this hole. And so very quickly, as he was trying to save himself, he would have started to struggle breathing because there just wasn't enough air in this hole. And so when it became clear he was starting to suffocate, he abandoned the approach of trying to dig himself out and began trying to contort his body outside of the hole at really extreme angles to try to pop his head out, even if it meant breaking his neck in the process. But no matter how hard he tried, he just could not get his head out. The following day, January 2nd at 4 p.m., this is after Stephen has been reported missing, a person walking through that forested park, they found Stephen. They saw his body poking out of that hole at a really extreme angle, and so they called the police. The police showed up to the park, and they confirmed that Stephen was dead. He had suffocated. His death was not ruled a suicide. It was determined to be an accident. As for Stephen's dog and his ferrets, they were found near his body, and they were unhurt. The next and final story of today's episode is called My Brother's Keeper. Just after midnight on March 9th, 1947, a man slipped out the front door of his 4-story brownstone mansion on New York City's iconic Fifth Avenue. The man was named Langley Collier. He was 61 years old, and he was a trained engineer. He was a very famous concert pianist, and he was very wealthy. But he didn't dress like he was wealthy. This night, Langley was going for an 8-mile walk to the south to Brooklyn, New York, where he was going to pick up a very specific thing that he needed for his older brother Homer, who was currently laid up in bed on the second floor of the mansion. It was a freezing cold night, and so as Langley walked along the road, he flipped up his collar of his very shabby wool coat that was held together by safety pins. Nowadays, Langley felt like the only time he was safe going outside was at night, because at nighttime he could kind of hide from the prying eyes of his neighbors or police officers or really anyone. It was the one time he could basically be invisible. And so Langley scurried his way down the dimly lit sidewalk, looking left and right constantly to make sure he wasn't being followed. And then finally at 2 a.m., he arrived at his destination in Brooklyn, a very particular set of dumpsters. And right away, Langley got to work. He went in that dumpster and he got the things he was looking for and then put them in his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and then began the long, slow walk back home. Several weeks later, on March 21st, the phone rang inside the police station near where the Collier brothers lived. And so a sergeant picked up the phone, and on the other line was a guy who called himself Charles Smith, and in a very gruff voice, he told the sergeant that there was a dead body in the Collier brothers' mansion. Now, while of course this was a huge tip, the sergeant was skeptical because the police were aware of the fact that there were lots of rumors floating around about the Collier brothers. They were very eccentric. I mean, Langley's going out at night with a bag over his shoulder and going to look at dumpsters in Brooklyn. I mean, they were also kind of reclusive, and the windows outside of their mansion were boarded up with wood and metal. And so people were kind of on edge about the Collier brothers, and periodically, when they heard rumors about them, they would call the police and report it. And so the police were used to getting these rumor calls, going and checking it out, only to discover that they were not true. And so this sergeant said to Charles Smith, well, how do you know there's a dead body inside the mansion? But the caller simply didn't answer and hung up. And so because the sergeant did not necessarily believe this was a credible tip, instead of sending an entire investigative team to the mansion to check out this dead body, he asked a single police officer to, when he had time, make his way over and basically do a wellness check on the Collier brothers. And so later that day, this one lone police officer showed up to the Collier brothers' mansion. He got out of his cruiser and he just stopped and looked at the brownstone mansion. Even though it was every bit a mansion, it was not in good condition. All the windows were boarded up with wood and metal, and the glass behind them was all shattered. There was newspapers coming out of the broken windows like they had been jammed up against the inside of the windows. There was all this furniture and wooden crates and just junk piled up outside the front of the property. I mean, the place looked kind of dilapidated, and he was shocked that anybody lived in here to begin with. But the Collier family were not normal people. Langley and Homer's dad was a doctor, and he would take home pieces of real people, like parts and organs and that kind of thing, and he would put them in glass jars and put them on display all over the house. Their dad also always canoed to work, which meant walking out of the mansion with a canoe on his shoulder, walking to East River, canoeing his way in his fancy doctor clothes all the way until he got off, and then carrying the canoe to his office building. As for Langley and Homer's mother, she was the first cousin of their dad, and she also kicked their dad out of the house when he tried to convert their entire house into a sanatorium, which is kind of like a cross between a hospital and a resort for people who are recovering from tuberculosis. And so the brothers had grown up in this very odd family, and while they were totally brilliant, they were also very eccentric. Homer, the older brother, was a literal genius who was accepted to study law at the highly prestigious Ivy League University, Columbia, at the age of 14. Langley, who was 5 years younger than Homer, also graduated from Columbia, where he got 2 degrees, one in engineering and one in chemistry. But Langley wasn't just an accomplished scientist, he was also this incredible musician. In fact, he was such a talented pianist that he actually performed shows at New York's legendary Carnegie Hall. But despite their incredible achievements and their huge wealth, Homer and Langley never got married. And over time, after the death of their parents, Homer and Langley became more and more reclusive inside of this mansion. And then in 1933, so 14 years before this lone police officer had arrived at the Collier brothers' mansion to investigate a dead body, Homer Collier had had a stroke and went completely blind. He was only 55 at the time, and really he was at the height of his career, but he was forced to quit his law practice. As for Langley, even though he was very successfully selling pianos and playing these incredible shows at Carnegie Hall, he too had to give up what he was doing and stay home and take care of his brother. And once this happened, the two brothers basically stayed in the mansion all the time. They basically never left. And they also stopped paying any of their bills, so their water, their phone, their electricity all got cut off. But instead of the brothers paying the bills to get the power back, Langley just went out and bought a Model T car, and he pulled the engine out of the car and built his own generator. And then when they stopped paying their mortgage, eventually the police came to the mansion to evict them. And when Langley came to the door to speak to the officer, he just wrote a check for the entire amount of the mansion, basically paying for it on the spot. He handed the check to the police officer and then told the officer to leave them alone. And so fast forward back to March 21st, 1947, and this lone police officer, after staring up at this dilapidated mansion, finally walked forward and climbed over all the furniture and junk that was all out front, and he literally climbed his way up the front steps to the front door, where he began pounding on it. But after a while, no one came to the door, and the officer couldn't hear anything inside. Now, because this officer was here to investigate a dead body, no matter how uncredible the claim, the officer knew he really needed to get inside and have a look around. And so he decided he would try to break in the front door. And so after knocking a few more times, just to make sure really no one was there, the officer called out and said, "I'm coming in," and then began pounding with his shoulder against the door. And pretty quickly, the door gave way. But it only opened a few inches. And so the officer tried to fit through it, but he was too big, he couldn't fit. But he was able to look into the crack, and he saw there was this huge man-made wall that was basically positioned right inside of the mansion, blocking the front door from opening more than a couple of inches. And so as the officer was thinking about why there would be this wall here, he began to smell this terrible smell coming out of the mansion. And at that point, the officer thought, okay, there could be a dead body in here. I don't know what's going on. And so he called for backup. When backup arrived, the group of officers attempted to smash the front door in together. All 7 of them are ramming against this door, but they could not break down the man-made wall inside. And so ultimately, the police got a ladder and they lined it up on the side of the property, and one of the officers was able to climb up to the second floor, break a window, and climb in that way. And once the police all made their way into the second floor of this mansion, they realized very quickly that the tip Charles Smith had given had been correct. There was a dead body inside of this mansion. It was Homer Collier, the older brother. He was seated in a chair in this alcove on the second floor. He only had on this ragged bathrobe, and he was kind of slouched forward with his head resting on his knee with all these orange peels all around him. The coroner would ultimately determine that Homer likely had been dead for about 10 hours. As for Langley Collier, despite looking around the mansion for him, they couldn't find him. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. And so pretty quickly, the police became suspicious of Langley because they couldn't find him, and they began to think, maybe he had something to do with his brother's death, and that's why he's not here now. In fact, maybe it was Langley who called in the tip as Charles Smith out on the road somewhere after he'd run away. So the police posted an officer at the Collier brothers' mansion. Basically, his job was to stay there in case Langley came back at any time. He could be detained. And then also the police put out a 9-state alarm. Basically, all the states around New York were told to keep an eye out for Langley because he was wanted for questioning in connection to his brother's death. And so as police agencies all across the East Coast searched for Langley, largely in vain, detectives in New York continued to search the Collier brothers' mansion to find clues that might shed some light about where Langley went and what role he might have played in Homer's death. And on April 8th, 1947, so 18 days after Homer was first discovered, the police would finally find that big clue that would break the case wide open. Back on March 21st, when that lone police officer first responded to the Collier brothers' house because of this call about the dead body, and then the officer broke the door in and discovered that man-made wall right behind the door, well, that man-made wall was not constructed out of normal building materials like brick or wood or anything else you might expect a wall to be built out of. Instead, it was built out of things like chairs and beds and a sewing machine and all sorts of just junk. It was trash. And this trash wall started right in front of the inside of the front door, and it extended back towards the interior living space of that floor. Except there really wasn't any living space at all anywhere inside of this mansion. Not the second floor, first, third, fourth, nowhere. Because every surface inside of this mansion was covered wall to wall, floor to ceiling in trash. Things like 14 broken pianos, an x-ray machine, there was a horse's jawbone, there were 25,000 books, and of course they had all of their father's glass jars that contained all of these human body parts. And over the years, the Collier brothers had apparently begun to think that their neighbors and random passerbys out on the street would someday break into their mansion and steal these treasures from their home. For reference, the Collier brothers did have real treasure in their house. They had tons of cash, they had jewelry, they had real valuables. But to them, that wasn't the real treasure. The real treasure were the things they pulled out of the dumpsters all around the city. And so that was the stuff they were worried about getting stolen from random people outside. And so they had begun fortifying the inside of this mansion to protect themselves when inevitably these people began breaking in. And so basically the inside of their mansion had not just been turned into a big trash pile, but instead they had created all these sophisticated tunnels through all the trash that was everywhere. And lining these tunnels and all these special alleyways they had built were real booby traps. And it was when the police were inspecting one of these tunnels with booby traps in it that they discovered the big clue that broke the case wide open. Based on that big clue, here is the leading theory about what happened to Homer and Langley Collier. Back on March 9th, 1947, so the night that Langley had snuck out the front door in the middle of the night with his shabby clothes on and headed to Brooklyn where he went dumpster diving, well, he wasn't just dumpster diving to find new treasures to bring back to the mansion to stuff inside. Instead, he was actually looking for something really specific for his brother. He was looking for oranges, like the fruit. And this particular dumpster in Brooklyn was right behind a store that sold fruit, and so there were always lots of oranges in this dumpster. Langley was actually trying his very best to take care of his older brother Homer. He had actually begun doing research using his father's old medical textbooks to try to find a cure for Homer's blindness caused by his stroke. And at some point, Langley believed he really had come across the cure. And the cure was basically for Homer to eat oranges. Lots and lots of oranges. And in fact, over the last several weeks before this night, Langley had already made this change in Homer's diet. He only fed him oranges for every single meal. He got them from this dumpster, and he fed them to Homer. And Homer, he too believed this cure was going to work, and so he ate the oranges without question. And so back on March 9th, after Langley had gathered up the oranges from inside this dumpster, slung it on his shoulder, and walked back to his mansion, he maneuvered his way through the crack in the front door because he was super skinny. He was able to barely get through. And then once he was inside the mansion and shut the door behind him, he maneuvered his way up to the second floor. And then he began the most dangerous part of his journey from one side of the second floor to the other where Homer was. Basically, Langley needed to crawl through a 2-foot wide tunnel he had built through all the junk and trash, but it was lined with booby traps. In particular, there was a nasty trap at the end of the tunnel where there was this stack of metal boxes filled with all these newspapers. They were really heavy, and they were positioned so if you even so much as barely touched the lowest box, they would come crashing down on you. Now, Langley had made this journey countless times. This is how he went to see his brother every single day, as he went through this tunnel. But on this day, as he low-crawled his way through the tight tunnel in the trash, he accidentally knocked the lowest metal box. The boxes tumbled down on him and pinned him to the ground. Now, these boxes were very heavy, but they were not heavy enough to kill someone. It would just pin them down. It would be impossible to get out from under them. And so Langley, very likely, after getting trapped, called out for his brother, Homer, who was actually only 10 feet away from him. But Homer was blind, he was sick, he had absolutely no energy because all he ate was oranges and it was basically killing him. And so he couldn't even get out of his chair, let alone go save his brother. And so for several agonizing hours, Langley likely yelled for his brother until the weight of all these boxes did crush him to death. And then Homer was left all alone in this house where no one knew he needed help and no one could even get to him if they wanted to. And so he was doomed. And so for 2 weeks, Homer just sat in this chair, starving to death, while he likely listened to the sound of rats eating his brother's body. The big clue that the police found that broke this case wide open is they actually spotted Langley's white foot bone that had been picked clean by the rats jutting up out of this trash tunnel 10 feet away from Homer. When the police had first searched the mansion, it was so full of stuff that they never saw this bone. It just kind of blended in. But 18 days after finding Homer, they realized Langley was right there. There was a skeleton. As for the Charles Smith tipster that police thought had to be Langley calling in after he had murdered his brother, well, it wasn't Langley because Langley was dead at the time this tip came in. And so Charles Smith was a real person who very likely just walked past the mansion and he probably caught a whiff of the smell of rotting dead bodies, and so he called it in. 4 months after Homer and Langley were found dead inside of their maze of trash, their mansion was declared a fire hazard and demolished. Today, there is a small park called the Collier Brothers Park, and it's filled with nothing but a couple of trees and a bench. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen podcast, as well as MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In December of 1988, a young woman was having coffee at her friend's house in the city of Tours, France. And at some point, she excused herself to go use the bathroom. And when she opened the lid of the toilet, she saw in the bowl were 2 small gold objects floating in the water. They looked like beads at first, or maybe broken pieces of jewelry. And so she leaned down close to get a better look. And then she realized what they actually were. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please ask the follow button to go get a matching tattoo with you. But after they finish getting theirs done, leave without getting yours. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of December 11th, 1988, a 38-year-old woman named Françoise Gendron touched up her lipstick in the bathroom mirror of a nightclub in the city of Tours, France. Her best friend, Sylvie Revirago, was washing her hands at the sink right next to her. Françoise and Sylvie were best friends. They had basically known each other forever, since they were just little kids. And these days, they went out together almost every single night. They were both divorced, and Francoise's 19-year-old son had recently moved out of the house, so she was making the most of her new freedom and staying out late all the time, often with Sylvie. Now, Francoise and Sylvie were not exactly the same in terms of, their attitude towards life. Francoise had always been much more sociable and had this huge circle of friends, and so really she was the one who often had to push her much more introverted friend Sylvie to come out with her, but she usually did. However, tonight, it was Francoise who turned to Sylvie and said that she actually wanted to go home now. She told Sylvie that the men they were there with at the club, Michel and Luc, were making her feel uncomfortable, and she wanted to leave. Now, it was clear to Francoise pretty much immediately that Sylvie was pretty disappointed. Despite being introverted, now that they were out, Sylvie wanted to stay out. And also, they regularly went out with Michel and Luc, and there was never any issues before, and so she said as much to Francoise, what do you mean? What's the issue? But Francoise just said she was getting a weird vibe from both of them and just would feel better if she went home. And so a few minutes later, Francoise and Sylvie walked back to the table where Michel and Luc were still sitting, and there was a receipt on the table, and Michel was putting his wallet away, like he had just paid for it. And actually, Michel, he turned to the women and he said, "Hey, are you guys ready to leave and go to the next club?" But Francoise, she just kind of smiled and grabbed her coat and said that actually she was going to leave now. She said she had to get home to her boyfriend, who was probably already at her apartment and waiting for her. The men were pretty surprised by this, and maybe even a little bit offended. And Michel actually asked Francoise, "Hey, are you sure everything's okay here? Is that really the reason you're leaving?" And Francoise just said, "Yep, everything's fine. I just gotta go." But she could definitely tell that the men did not believe her. But Francoise didn't really care. At this point, she really just wanted to leave. And so she just turned and gave Sylvie a hug and then just said bye to the group, who were just kind of sitting there somewhat stunned this is happening so quickly. And then Francoise turned and she hustled right out of the club and flagged down a cab before any of them could follow her. The next morning, Francoise woke up in her own bed to the sound of her boyfriend, Yves Martin, bustling around her bedroom and getting dressed. She rolled over to look at her alarm clock and saw that it was 8 a.m. Francoise sat up, and Yves turned to her and said good morning, but she immediately noticed that his voice was cold. And she knew why. The night before, when she had come home, they had gotten into a big argument because, he had been waiting for her for quite a while, for hours, by the time she finally got there. That was the reason she had to leave, and it really had upset him. And in many ways, this was not like a one-off issue in their relationship. It was a recurring one. Francoise was always staying out super late with her friends, and often with her male friends. And Yves felt like she was basically prioritizing all of them over him. He worked during the day, so the evenings were really the only time that he and Francoise could reasonably get together. But Francoise never seemed to get home until super late, and at that point it was too late for Yves to come over, or vice versa, and so they just didn't get to see each other as much as they could be. And so now, Francoise knew she had to do something to try to smooth things over with her boyfriend. So she turned to Yves and said, "Hey, do you want to come over tonight after you get off work?" And she promised she would actually be home when he got there, so they could cook dinner together and just spend some time together. It would be just a night for them. And at that, Francoise saw Yves' shoulders immediately relax. And then he turned around and he smiled at her and said, "You know what? I'd really, really like that." And so at this point, the mood in the room completely shifted. They were sort of back on good terms. And so as Yves finished getting dressed, he asked Francoise what else she had going on that day. And she told him that she had a handyman she knew named Christian Moreau who was coming by that morning to put up new wallpaper in the apartment. So she'd very likely be stuck at home for most of the day while he worked on it. The two chatted for a bit longer, and then once Yves was ready to leave, Francoise kissed him goodbye, and then after he left, Francoise pulled herself out of bed and put on a robe. And then she went into the kitchen, and she opened up a can of food for her cat, and then she made herself some coffee. She was a bit hungover from the night before, and she thought maybe a warm bath would make her feel better. So after she drank her coffee, she ran a bath, she got into the water, and she closed her eyes. At 11 a.m. the next morning, so December 13th, a janitor at the Trousseau Hospital in Tours, France, was carrying a trash bag out to the dumpster when he noticed something odd. There were two blue trash bags just sitting out on a strip of grass in the middle of the hospital's parking lot. Now, the trash bags they used at the hospital were gray, so the janitor knew these blue bags, had to have been left there by someone from outside of the hospital. So the janitor walked over to the bags and sort of inspected them from the outside, and they were sort of bulky, but you couldn't really tell what was inside of them. And then he just reached down and he opened one of them, and when he saw what was inside, he immediately stumbled back, turned, and ran inside, shouting for someone to call the police. About an hour later, so just before noon on December 13th, 1988, Chief Inspector Francois Barbier of the Tours Police Department walked across the parking lot of the Trousseau Hospital. He'd been sent out here to investigate human remains that had been found outside of the hospital, and he was the first officer to arrive on the scene, and so now a janitor was walking with him to show him the way to where the remains had been found. They walked over to a grassy strip in the middle of the parking lot, and they stopped next to a pair of blue trash bags. Inspector Barbier knelt down and he opened up one of the bags, and inside, he saw very clearly there were 2 severed arms and the lower part of 2 legs. He opened up the other blue bag and he found it contained a woman's torso, but there was no pelvis, no thighs, and no head. Barbier turned to the janitor, who he knew had found the remains, and he asked him, when did you find this? And the janitor said that he had been out doing his rounds, throwing his own trash away around 11 a.m., and that's when he had seen them. But they definitely had not been there when he had done his rounds at 9 a.m. that day. So clearly these had to have been dropped off sometime between 9 and 11. Barbier stood up and looked around, and he noticed there actually was a medical school right down the street. And for a second, he wondered if maybe this was all just a tasteless prank by some of the students who could have maybe stolen a cadaver from the hospital's morgue and dropped it here. But as he thought about it, he just couldn't imagine medical students desecrating a human body like that. I mean, even as a prank, it just seemed not possible. And so to him, it just seemed like the more obvious answer here, albeit a gruesome one, was that this woman contained in these 2 bags had been murdered, and whoever killed her chopped her body up and put them in these bags because it would be easier to dispose of her body that way. And so Barbier hoped that when the forensics team showed up, they'd be able to find fingerprints from the killer on the blue trash bags. Because at this point, they didn't have a head of this woman. The victim didn't have a head. And so it could be very challenging to identify who it was. And if you didn't know who the victim was, it would be even harder to narrow down who might have killed her. 4 days later, on the afternoon of December 17th, Barbier was reading over an autopsy report at his desk. After the initial discovery of those blue trash bags at the hospital, more body parts from what appeared to be the same body had been found dumped behind a clothing store in a commercial part of town. But the head was still missing. And with no clues as to who the victim was, the investigation really was just barely crawling along. The police had put out a press release about the body's discovery, but so far no one had come forward with information, and there had been no women who had been reported missing in the area recently. Also, no usable fingerprints had been found on the trash bags, and so at this point, they really just didn't have forensic evidence, and so they were not able to even begin to track down who the killer was or what happened to them. And now, as Barbier continued to read through this autopsy report, he saw that the medical examiner had run the victim's fingerprints through the database, but there was no match. And so again, there's just no leads in this case so far. However, as Barbier continued reading through this report, he saw that the autopsy did reveal that the victim had died recently, probably only 1 day before her remains were discovered. She appeared to have bled to death from 2 deep gashes on her wrists, and there were also traces of an anti-anxiety medicine that was in her blood, which suggested she might have been drugged before she was killed. And Barbier was sort of baffled by this, because the method of murder almost seemed gentle and controlled compared to the extreme violence that was done to the body post-mortem. Those 2 things were totally in contrast with each other. And so he wondered if this was all done this way out of necessity. And so maybe the killer was just too small or too weak, or maybe both, to kill the victim without sedating her first. And then also, along those same lines, maybe they couldn't move her body without chopping it up first. And so as Barbier is just sort of thinking through what could have happened here, the phone on his desk rang. He put down the report and he picked up the phone, and it was a woman who said that she had just seen a newspaper article about the dead body, and she thought it could be a woman named Françoise Gendron, who lived in an apartment complex called La Vallée Violette. And so Barbier immediately sat up, he grabbed his pen, and he wrote down the name and the address. But before he could ask who the caller was or why she thought the victim could be this woman Françoise, the caller hung up. Half an hour later, Barbier walked through the hallway on the first floor of the La Vallée Violette apartment complex, where his mystery caller had told him his victim lived. This was the first lead he had gotten since the body was found, so he was hopeful that something would come of it. Now, the woman who called didn't actually give the apartment number for Francoise, just that she lived in this complex. And so Barbier just literally walked down the hallway and knocked on an apartment door at random. And the man who answered, Barbier asked him if he knew a woman named Francoise Gendron, and did she live here? And the man just nodded and said, yep, she lives here. And then he pointed to a door right down the same hallway. And then the man, unprompted, told Barbier that he hadn't seen anybody go in or out of that apartment for at least a few days, and he was starting to get worried about Francoise's cat. Barbier's heart began to race, because if Francoise really did live in that apartment, and she really hadn't been around in days, well, it seemed very possible that she was his victim. So he thanked the man and said he would handle it, and then he walked down the hallway to the door, and he knocked. And there was no answer. But he could hear a cat meowing inside. And so at this point, Barbier was feeling really confident about the anonymous tip. And so he just turned and hurried back out to his car, and he radioed for a forensics team to come to this apartment complex. And then a few minutes later, they arrived carrying a battering ram to break down the door. And so Barbier and the team, they go back down the hallway to Francoise's door. Barbier got out of the way, and then the officers smashed it down with this ram. And then once it was open, Barbier stepped inside the apartment. As soon as Barbier was in this apartment, he was standing in the living room, and he looked around and nothing seemed disturbed. However, when he left the living room and went into the kitchen, it was a different story. Now, the kitchen was not a total disaster, but there was a broken dish on the ground and some food items that must have been on the dish at some point that also were scattered across the floor. And so just at first glance, it appeared like maybe some sort of struggle happened in here. However, Barbier looked around the kitchen and he didn't find any blood anywhere, so it was just this broken plate. And then when Barbier checked the rest of the apartment, no drawers or closets looked like they'd been ransacked, so this didn't appear like an apartment that had been robbed at any point. However, one thing Barbier did notice was in the bedroom, there were a few unopened rolls of wallpaper on a stool, like as if somebody had been about to do some work in the bedroom, but then just didn't. Barbier told the forensics team to first make sure the cat got fed, because there was a cat in here, and the cat was, a little malnourished, but basically okay. And then to sweep the apartment for fingerprints to see whether Francoise's prints matched the victim. And if she was the victim, he was hoping they might also find fingerprints or blood inside the apartment from whoever might have killed her. And so the forensics team, they got to work, and Barbier, he just continued sort of walking around the apartment, looking at photos that were out on display to maybe get a sense of Francoise's body size, to sort of mentally compare it to the victim's body. And as he was doing this, he happened to glance out the window and he saw a young man standing on the sidewalk outside who clearly was watching the police through the glass. And when Barbier locked eyes with this guy, the guy suddenly looked terrified and he just turned and began speed walking away, at which point Barbier opened up the window and shouted at this guy to stay right where he was. An hour later, Inspector Barbier walked into an interview room at the Tours police station and sat down across from the young man who had been watching Francoise's apartment. By now, he knew this man's name was Yves Martin, and he claimed to have been Francoise's boyfriend. And so Barbier sits down and he asks Yves, what were you doing outside of Francoise's apartment when I saw you? And Yves said that he had just come by the apartment to see if Francoise was home, but he got there and saw police inside and he knew something was wrong. But he specified that he hadn't seen or heard from her in about 5 days and didn't know she was missing, like the last time he spoke to her was the morning of December 12th. Now, the instant Yves said December 12th, Barbier thought of two things. One is that was actually the day before the body was found in the parking lot. And two, based on the autopsy report, it was presumed that the victim was killed the day before her body was found, so December 12th. And so it's pretty suspicious that this guy is mentioning December 12th as the last time he saw Francoise. And so Barbier leaned in and he asked Yves to elaborate about the last time he saw Francoise on the 12th. And Yves said he had seen Francoise at her own apartment when he left the apartment around 8 a.m. on the 12th, and the two of them had made plans to meet up again at her place that evening. But he said when he got there that night, she wasn't home. But this was not unusual for her. So Yves explained that he just let himself inside her apartment with the spare key she had given him, and he just made himself dinner and he watched TV while he waited for her to eventually show up. And then he said at around 8 p.m., her landline, her home landline phone began to ring. Yves said that he answered the phone, which was not totally unusual, and he said the person who was calling claimed to be one of Francoise's friends. Yves said he didn't recognize the voice, but he said Francoise had a big circle of friends, and he for sure did not know all of them. But Yves told Barbier that this caller was not calling the apartment to try to reach Francoise. They were calling the apartment to reach him, Yves, to tell him that apparently Francoise had decided to go out of town this weekend with some other friends and that she would not be home tonight. And Yves said this was not the first time that Francoise had ditched him. And so in his frustration after being told this by this friend, he said he grabbed his dinner plate and just chucked it on the floor and shattered it, and then he left. Barbier was surprised to hear this, and he was thinking if Yves was the type of person who would immediately start breaking things over something that, didn't seem like that big of a deal, well, what else was he capable of? However, as potentially suspicious as Yves was, Barbier had not actually confirmed whether Francoise was even his victim. This could just be a coincidence here, that she left town right before this body was found. Like, she could be just fine. And so before Barbier let Yves go, because he couldn't really hold him at this point, he asked Yves to just give him a detailed account of what else he had done on December 12th. He wanted to get the full timeline of what he did on that day. And Yves just said after he had left Francoise's apartment that morning, when he and Francoise had made plans to meet up that night, he said he had spent most of the day at work, and then he had gone back to Francoise's apartment after work, and then after he had waited around for a while and got that phone call and broke the plate, he said he had just left and gone straight to his own apartment, which he shared with his mother, and he was there all night. And so Barbier wrote down what he said and made a note to follow up on his alibi. And then before he let Yves go, he just asked him if Francoise was planning to go anywhere or meet anybody on the day he last saw her. And Yves, he thought about it for a moment, and then he said, yeah, actually there was one thing Francoise had mentioned to him. She had told him that an acquaintance named Christian Moreau was supposed to come over her apartment later that morning to put up some new wallpaper in her apartment. The next morning, December 18th, Inspector Barbier knocked on the door of Christian's apartment, the guy who was going to put up the wallpaper. Now, at this point, forensics still had not confirmed whether or not Francoise was the victim. But for the time being, Barbier was working under the assumption that she was. A few seconds later, a young man answered the door and confirmed he was Christian Moreau. And so Barbier asked him if he remembered going to Francois Gendron's apartment on December 12th. And Christian said yes, he did remember, but he seemed confused about why he was being asked about it by a police officer. Barbier explained that Francoise was presumed to be missing and had even been possibly killed on the same day that Christian was at her apartment. And Christian looked very surprised to hear this. And he just said, I was there on the 12th. I got there around 10 a.m. that morning. Francoise seemed perfectly fine. She appeared to have just gotten out of the bath, and it just didn't seem like anything was wrong. However, Christian said he was only in the apartment around Francoise for like a minute because he just dropped off the new wallpaper and was going to install it on another day. So it was a very brief interaction, but again, she seemed fine during this very brief interaction. Barbier obviously had seen those rolls of new wallpaper just sitting in Francoise's apartment, so he figured this part of Christian's story had to be true, that he must have dropped them off. But it did seem a bit odd to drop the wallpaper off on one day and then come back at another time to actually perform the work. Like, you could easily just do those two things at the same time. So he wondered whether this had actually been the plan all along, or if something unexpected had happened inside of the apartment with Francoise that had somehow stopped Christian from installing the wallpaper on that first visit. So Barbier asked Christian for his alibi for the rest of the day that Francoise had last been seen, which was the 12th. And Christian went over his entire day, he provided all the information, and then afterwards, Barbier, after taking down some notes, he said he would be in touch. Now, at this moment, Barbier didn't have enough evidence to hold Christian for more questioning. But as he walked back to his car, Barbier hoped that forensics might find some fingerprints or blood in Francoise's apartment that could implicate Christian. A day later, Barbier sat down at his desk and read over a forensics report on Francoise's apartment. Now, there hadn't been any blood traces found, but a set of fingerprints had been pulled from the phone, and they matched the hands that had been found inside the blue trash bag. So this confirmed that Francoise was indeed the victim. But so far, there was no evidence pointing to who killed her. Yves, Francoise's boyfriend, his alibi checked out. And that handyman, Christian Moreau, he also had a solid alibi. And then as for Francoise's 19-year-old son, who was serving in the military, well, he was confirmed to have been at his barracks over 200 miles away at the time of the murder, and so he was ruled out as a suspect. And then also he would say that he had not heard from his mother since several days before she was actually killed. Barbier was still trying to figure out who was that person who called Francoise's apartment when Eve was there to tell Eve that, hey, your girlfriend's going to be out of town this weekend, because it just seemed like that was pretty suspicious, and this person who was calling must know something about Francoise's death. But this was the 1980s, so it was harder to get a hold of phone logs than it is today. Now, Barbier had submitted an order for those phone logs, but the order had to be signed by a judge still, and then it could also take several more days beyond that to actually get the records, and so there was a bit of a wait. However, just then, another officer knocked on Barbier's door and said that a phone call had just come in from someone claiming to have information about Francoise Gendron. And so Barbier, he picks up the phone, and he hears a woman's voice, and this woman tells him that she has information on Francoise. And Barbier immediately wondered, is this the same anonymous woman who called in before with that tip that Francoise was the victim? But Barbier just couldn't quite tell if it was the same voice. And so this woman told Barbier that she had been a very close friend of Francoise's, and she knew about two men named Michel and Luc who might have been involved in Francoise's death. She said right before she died, Francoise had found out that these two men were secretly involved in drug trafficking. And apparently they had talked about killing Francoise if she reported them to the police. Specifically, the caller said these two men had threatened Francoise that they would drug her, bleed her out, chop her into pieces, and then cut off her head so she could never be identified. Early the next morning, so on December 20th, 1988, 7 days after Francoise's body was found, Chief Inspector Barbier pulled up outside of a discount store in a shopping area in Tours. In front of the store, there were two men unloading boxes from a semi-truck. Barbier, he got out of his car and he began walking towards them. And when these two men saw the detective approaching, they immediately seemed sort of panicked. And when Barbier got close enough, he asked them if they were the store's owners, Michel and Luc, and one of the men nodded. At which point Barbier said, "You two are coming with me." About an hour later, Barbier walked down the hallway at the police station, past the doors of the interrogation rooms where Michel and Luc were currently being held. But first, he wanted to speak to the third person the police had brought in for questioning that morning, Sylvie Reverigo, who happened to be Francoise's best friend and friends with Michel and Luc. And he sat down across from her and he basically said, look, we know you're connected to the two men, Michel and Luc, and also to Francoise, and we want to know if you know anything about these two guys, because apparently they could have been threatening Francoise. We think they could be involved. Tell me everything you know. And Sylvie would tell Barbier that she was actually scared of Michel and Luc, and that was why she had not come to police yet, because she was worried if she told them what she knew, they would hurt her. She told Barbier that those two men had told her, Sylvie, that they intended to kill Francoise because they were worried that Francoise was going to report them to police for drug trafficking and selling stolen cars. And Sylvie said she didn't know if they were actually capable of that, but she just was too worried about going to the police about it and feared they would find out and then she would become a target as well. And so he and Sylvie chatted for a bit longer, and he got some additional information about when exactly they spoke to her and said this, and some other details about sort of their demeanor and the people they hung out with. And then after that, Barbier got up, he left the interrogation room, and in the hallway, he caught up with the detective who had actually already begun interrogating Luc. And the detective said that so far, Luc had totally refused to cooperate, and he'd outright denied even knowing who Sylvie was. Barbier sighed when he heard this, and he had a feeling right away that Michel was not going to be any more cooperative. But he was going to try his best to crack him. So Barbier went into the room where Michel was being held, and after he sat down, he just asked Michel if he had seen the news about that woman who was found chopped up in trash bags in a hospital parking lot. And Michel said yes, he had heard about that. And then he made a joke that maybe a surgeon at the hospital had made a pretty bad mistake or something. Barbier didn't react to the joke, and instead he just pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. And then Michel, he opened it up, and what he saw were photos of those blue trash bags and also photos of the severed body parts that had been found inside of them. And when Michel saw these pictures, he went completely pale. Barbier then asked Michel, "Do you know who that body belonged to?" And Michel, he just looked up and shook his head and said no. Barbier just stared at Michel for a moment, sort of just gauging his reaction. And then eventually he said, well, the body belonged to Françoise Gendron. When Michel heard this, he really looked like he was in complete shock. But Barbier immediately followed up and said, Michel, did you kill Françoise? And Michel, his reaction was to immediately shout no, that Françoise was a great friend of his and he would never hurt her. Barbier was crazy for thinking he would do that. And then again and again, he just insisted that he was completely innocent here. Now, immediately, Barbier thought Michel's reaction here was pretty genuine. But just then, there was a knock on the door, and so Barbier, he got up and he stepped out into the hallway, and another officer told him that the forensics team had just found a piece of evidence that almost certainly would crack this case wide open. Based on forensic evidence and an eventual confession, this is what police believe happened to Françoise Gendron on the morning of December 12, 1988. Around 10 a.m., the killer knocked on the door of Françoise's apartment. Françoise answered the door wrapped in a towel and told the killer to come on inside. The killer stepped in, and they acted very friendly and casual, as if this visit was nothing out of the ordinary. But after the two had chatted for a while, the killer decided it was time to put their plan into action. After all, Françoise was a problem for them, and they had to deal with her once and for all. So, at some point, the killer told Françoise that they had something they wanted to show her, and asked if she would come over to the killer's home just for a minute to show them. Françoise eventually agreed, and once she got dressed, the two of them headed out together. And so the two of them, they walked their way to the killer's home, they go inside, and then before the killer is going to show Françoise, what they brought them over here to show them, they first made them both a pot of tea. And critically, the killer crushed up a few anti-anxiety pills and put those in the bottom of Françoise's cup of tea. Then the killer brought the tea over to the kitchen table where Françoise was sitting, and the killer sat down with her, and they both drank their tea. The killer made sure Françoise drank her entire cup, but by the time Françoise had finished her tea, she was so sedated from the drugs that she could barely sit up. At this point, the killer knew they could move on to the next phase of their plan. And so the killer at this point lifted Françoise up out of the seat. She didn't put up a fight, and they carried her over to the bathroom, and they put her into the tub, and they turned on the water. And then eventually, when the water filled up high enough, the killer just pushed Françoise's head under the water, and again, Françoise, because of the drugs, couldn't do anything to stop it. And she remained under the water until she fell unconscious. Then the killer grabbed a nearby scalpel, reached into the tub, and cut each of Françoise's wrists. And then Françoise just laid in the tub and bled out. After Françoise was dead, the killer simply drained the tub and then cut Françoise's body into pieces to make it easier to dispose of. They took the pieces of her limbs and torso and shoved them into blue trash bags and then dumped them in the parking lot of a nearby hospital 10 minutes away. But the bigger problem for the killer was Françoise's head. The killer wanted to completely erase Françoise's identity. So, for that reason, they kept her head at their home and they put it in the oven and they cooked it overnight. So the skull would then become soft enough that they could crush it with a hammer. And then after smashing up Françoise's head, they would flush Françoise's teeth down the toilet, and they would take the other pieces of her head and they would throw them into a nearby river. However, despite all this effort, the killer forgot one thing, which was they put Françoise's hands in those blue trash bags, and so her body was identified by her fingerprints just a few days later. And then not long after that, a tip soon led the police right to the killer's door, and when they investigated the killer's home, they found crucial pieces of evidence in her bathroom. The killer was Françoise's own best friend, Sylvie Reverigo. Sylvie had always been sort of jealous of Françoise, primarily because she seemed happy all the time. And on top of that, Françoise got a lot of attention from men, which just, again, made Sylvie jealous. And since the two women, post-divorce, were spending so much time together, even more than in their childhood, their friendship had gotten suffocatingly close. And over this recent period of time where they were sort of on top of each other, Sylvie's jealousy and sort of resentment towards Françoise turned into full-blown hatred. Initially, Sylvie had tried to pin the murder on Michel and Luc by telling another friend of Françoise's, a woman named Yvette, that those two men had threatened to kill Françoise. And just as Sylvie had hoped, Yvette had called the police and passed along what she had said. But unbeknownst to Sylvie, Yvette also shared another tip with the investigators, which was that a few days after the murder, Yvette's own daughter had happened to go to Sylvie's house, and her daughter had found 2 gold dental crowns in the toilet. And the daughter and Yvette both knew that Francoise had gold dental crowns. So, by the time Sylvie was brought in for questioning, Inspector Barbier was already pretty sure she must have had something to do with Francoise's death. And so police would search Sylvie's home, and they would find traces of blood, and they would also find some of Francoise's jewelry hidden inside of a box. And then when Sylvie was confronted with all this evidence and testimony during her interrogation, Sylvie broke down and confessed. Sylvie Reverigo was charged with Francoise's murder on December 21st, 1988. 3 years later, she was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Kate Gallagher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In June of 2005, a customer at a gas station in Derry, New Hampshire, carried a prepaid cell phone to the counter. They paid for it in cash, and then afterwards they went out to their car and cut open the packaging. Then once they had the phone, they dialed a number to activate it. But when the customer service rep asked for their name, the customer hesitated. Because the whole reason they'd bought this prepaid phone in the first place was specifically so nobody could trace the calls back to their real identity. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the follow button a nice home-cooked meal. But be sure you first douse it with liquid laxative. Okay, let's get into today's story. On an afternoon in June of 2005, a 57-year-old truck driver named Jack Reed took a sip of his margarita at a barbecue in a park in Derry, New Hampshire. Now, he usually didn't drink, but today he was celebrating. It was his daughter Megan's high school graduation party. And this was a big deal for Jack. He'd grown up in the foster care system with nothing, and he'd worked really hard to ensure that his kids were set up for a better life than he had. So he was just really proud of Megan for making the right choices and finishing school. Now he looked over and he saw Megan sitting at a picnic table with her brother, Jack Jr., and also their mother, Virginia. Even though he and Virginia were not together anymore, they were still on good terms, and he was glad the whole family could be there for this special occasion. But then, Jack tensed up as he spotted somebody else who was walking across the grass toward them, Megan's boyfriend, Walter. So Megan and Walter had moved in together recently, and Jack was definitely not thrilled about it. He didn't have anything against Walter in particular, but his daughter was just 18 years old, and he thought that she was definitely too young to be living with a boyfriend. But Jack didn't want to pick a fight about it on a day like this.
So instead, he actually got up and walked over to Walter and gave him a big friendly hug and said he was glad to see him. Then they both sat down at the table and joined the family's conversation, and as Jack took another sip of his margarita, he actually felt himself relax. That evening, after the party was over, Jack drove his car home and stopped at a gas station along the way. He parked at the pump, he went inside, and then passed the cashier a few bills for a tank of gas, and also a lottery ticket. Jack was a regular lottery player, and even though he'd never won anything particularly big, he was always hoping that one day he would hit the jackpot and strike it rich. So he put the ticket in his pocket and then went back outside and filled up his car. Then he got in his car and he drove a few more blocks to his home, which was a trailer parked behind a warehouse on the edge of town. And one big reason Jack chose to live here was because there was plenty of room to park all of his work vehicles, including a large red and black dump truck. After years of working as a truck driver, Jack had built his own trucking business from the ground up. He did garbage removal and moving and other odd jobs, and he was making a decent living. But he still lived frugally in his rented trailer so he could save up for retirement. His goal was to save enough so that in a couple of years, once Jack Jr. was done with school, he could leave the cold New Hampshire winters behind and move to sunny, beautiful Las Vegas. He'd gotten the idea a couple of years ago when he'd done a moving job for a local self-made millionaire who was moving from New Hampshire to Vegas. He saw the millionaire as a huge success story, and he believed that if he worked hard enough, or maybe got lucky enough, he could follow in this same path. Now, Jack got out of his car and he walked over to his trailer. He opened up the door and he went inside. He turned on the lights and he was just about to sit down to take off his shoes when he heard a noise outside. Immediately, he went to the window and pulled back the curtains and he looked outside into the woods behind the property, but he didn't see anything. Still, he felt his heart racing and he actually had to take a few deep breaths to calm himself down. So almost 2 years ago, there'd been an incident where Jack heard someone creeping around outside his trailer. He'd grabbed his gun and went out to confront them, and he'd seen a man standing at the edge of the woods. The man had stared right at him and actually called out his name. Jack had actually fired his gun at this man, who then ran away into the woods and never came back. But Jack had never figured out what the encounter was about. As far as he knew, he didn't have any enemies, so it really just didn't make any sense. But again, since this strange guy was never caught, Jack was still very on edge whenever he heard strange noises outside and around his trailer. Now, as he looked out the window and he felt sure that there was nobody there, Jack closed the curtains and took the lottery ticket out of his pocket. He sat down at the table and he started scratching off the silver foil with a coin. And he was not a winner this time. But it didn't dampen his mood. Next time, he knew might be his lucky break. A couple of weeks later, on the morning of Monday, June 27th, Jack climbed up into his dump truck and rolled down the windows. It was already pretty hot outside, and he was on his way to the only job he had lined up for that day, a trash disposal gig that would likely only take a few hours. So he started the truck, and as he pulled out onto the road, his cell phone rang. He answered it, and a man spoke and said his name was Charlie, and that he had heard Jack did some work, hauling stuff away, and that, he had this new barn that really needed to be cleaned out, and could Jack do it? Jack said sure, he could actually do it that afternoon. And then he grabbed his logbook off the passenger seat, and he flipped to a blank page, and he scribbled down Charlie's name and address, which was in Deerfield, almost 30 miles away. Jack told Charlie he would let him know as soon as he was on the way, and then the two men hung up. Around 3 p.m. that afternoon, Jack drove down a very secluded 2-lane road in Deerfield. It was sweltering outside, and he was already exhausted and dripping with sweat from his trash disposal gig that morning. He had no idea what to expect going into this barn cleaning job with this guy Charlie, but he was hoping it wouldn't take too long. Jack slowed down as the trees to his right parted, and a gravel driveway appeared. He turned onto the driveway, and a few seconds later, he pulled up right outside of a white 2-story house with a big barn out back. Jack parked his dump truck and walked right up to the front door. He rang the doorbell, and a moment later, the door opened. 2 days later, on the afternoon of June 29th, Jack's daughter, Megan, and her boyfriend, Walter, walked up to the front door of Jack's trailer. Megan noticed that Jack's dump truck was not parked outside, which seemed wrong, and so she immediately felt this knot in her stomach. About an hour earlier, Megan had gotten a call from her mother, Virginia, saying that Jack had not shown up to a job that morning and he was not answering his phone. This was unlike him, so Megan had said that she and Walter would just go over to his trailer and make sure he was okay. Now, initially, Megan had assumed her dad had just overslept or maybe forgot about the job. But now it looked like he'd actually left for work because the dump truck wasn't there, but never actually made it to the job. But nonetheless, Megan knocked on the trailer door, just to be sure her dad really wasn't home, and there was no answer. And so at this point, Megan called her mom to tell her what she had seen and, the fact that her dad wasn't here. And she also told her mom that she was starting to feel pretty worried. And then a few minutes later, Virginia pulled up in her car. Megan, Walter, and Virginia all just stayed there right at the trailer all afternoon, hoping that maybe Jack would just show up at some point. And the whole time they're calling him over and over again, but it just kept going straight to voicemail. And then finally, around 6:30 p.m., when still they had not seen or heard from Jack, they decided it was time to call the police. On Tuesday, July 5th, so 6 days after Jack was reported missing by his family, Derry police detective Mike Hoole pulled into the parking lot of a Target store about an hour's drive south in Saugus, Massachusetts. Hoole slowed down and began to sort of slow roll through the rows of cars, keeping an eye out for one particular vehicle. Hoole was in charge of Jack's missing persons case, which had not really been going anywhere so far. According to his family, the last time anybody had seen or heard from Jack was actually on June 27th, so 2 days before he was reported missing to the police. But his family could not think of anywhere Jack might have gone or anybody who might want to hurt him. So initially, Hoole had figured that Jack must have just driven off for some time alone and that he would just come home sooner or later. But that morning, he'd gotten another call from Jack's daughter, Megan. She said the family had put up all these missing posters around town for Jack, and somebody had called her and said they actually saw Jack's dump truck at this particular Target in Saugus, more than 40 miles away from Derry. Now, this tip was unique enough that Hoole decided he would just drive out and take a look for himself. And now, as he slowly made his way towards the back of this parking lot, he saw it, a red and black dump truck parked near the back corner. So Hoole stopped his car and he walked over to look at this truck, and right away he saw the license plate confirmed this truck was definitely Jack's. When Hoole peeked in the driver's side window, though, he didn't see anybody inside. But there were flies buzzing around the back of the truck, basically the open section of the dump truck. There was something in there the flies were attracted to. And there was also very clearly a rotten, awful smell wafting out of the back of this truck. And so Hoole put on some gloves and he climbed up the side of the dump truck. Now, the actual bed of this dump truck was covered by a tarp. And so Hoole grabbed the tarp and he pulled it back, but he still did not have an unobstructed view because whatever was in the bed was also wrapped in plastic, and quite a bit of it. So he pulled out a knife and began cutting through the plastic. Less than an hour later, Detective Hoole stood by as workers from the medical examiner's office loaded Jack's body into their van, and he was still wrapped up in plastic. Hoole really wanted to get a look at Jack's body to figure out how he died, but that would require cutting through all the plastic that he was wrapped in. And Hoole knew he needed to leave all that intact for evidentiary purposes. So he'd just have to wait until the autopsy to find out the cause of death here. But from the way Jack's body had been disposed of, hidden in a parking lot 40 miles from his house, Hoole was already guessing that this was 1, a murder, and 2, it was carefully planned, probably by somebody that Jack knew. Hoole had already found out from the family that Jack had 5 children with 2 different women, and so he figured there could be some hidden tensions between any of them. But he also thought the murder could be tied to Jack's business. Now, as far as Jack's family knew, everything Jack did with his business was above board. But it's entirely possible that he might have gotten involved with sketchy people or maybe done something that made a client angry that the family didn't know about. Also, leaving Jack's dead body in the back of his own dump truck definitely seemed like a way to send a message. So, once the forensics team had taken photos and swabbed the truck for DNA and fingerprints, Hoole pulled on a pair of latex gloves and opened up the driver's side door. There was no blood inside the cabin of the truck, no sign of a weapon, and really nothing that struck him as unusual or helpful. That is, until he saw the logbook that was tucked into a pocket on the passenger side door. He reached for it, pulled it out, and began to flip through it, and he saw there was a list of all of Jack's appointments, along with the names, addresses, and phone numbers of the clients who had hired him. The last job that was recorded in this book was on the morning of June 27th, back in Derry, where Jack lived. Now, there were no other jobs noted down for that day, but a couple of pages later, on an otherwise blank page, Hoole found an entry that Jack seemed to have scribbled down in a rush. It was just an address, 145 North Road, no town listed, and the name was just Charlie for the client. Hoole placed the logbook inside of an evidence bag and he sealed it. And then, as he sort of looked around the area, he noticed all the security cameras on light posts all over the parking lot, and there happened to be one that was pointing directly at Jack's truck. The next day, so Wednesday, July 6th, Hoole was back at the precinct in Derry, reading over an autopsy report that had just been sent over from the Massachusetts Medical Examiner. The description in the report said that Jack had been severely beaten. He had broken ribs, skull fractures, and a softball-sized hole in the side of his head. His face had been so mangled that they'd actually had to pull Jack's dental records to confirm that it was actually him. Hoole thought this level of violence definitely made this murder feel really personal, and it only made him more confident that Jack's killer or killers was somebody who knew him. Just then, Hoole heard a knock at his door, and he looked up as an officer peeked his head into Hoole's office and asked him to come take a look at something. So Hoole stood up from his desk, and he followed the officer down the hallway to another room where a team of investigators were poring over that security footage from the Target parking lot. Hoole watched over their shoulders as the investigators pulled up a specific clip, and he could see from the timestamp in the corner of the screen that this footage was from around 5:30 p.m. on June 27th, which was the day of the last job written in Jack's logbook. Once it was up on the screen, Hoole nodded for the investigators to press play, and then he watched as the footage played on screen. And it showed Jack's dump truck pulling into the parking lot, followed closely by a white minivan. After Jack's truck parked, two people got out of the truck. And unfortunately, it was impossible to identify really anything about these people. They couldn't tell if they were men or women or man and woman. It was just totally unclear. However, there was one thing that was definitely true about these people, and it was what they were actually doing. They were clearly dumping Jack's body. One of them went around to the back of the dump truck and checked to make sure that tarp was secure, and then they both walked over to the white minivan, got in, and drove away. And so Hoole's mind was racing now, because it looked like there were at least 3 people involved in Jack's murder. There were the 2 people that were just out and about, sort of dealing with the truck, and then whoever was driving the white minivan. But another unfortunate reality was this footage was so fuzzy that they couldn't even pull the license plate for that minivan. And Hoole was naturally pretty frustrated by that. But then the investigator said there was actually one more thing he wanted to show him, and he pulled up another portion of security video. This one was from the evening of July 4th, which was 7 days after Jack's dump truck was left abandoned in the parking lot, and 1 day before police, i.e. Hoole, found the truck parked in that lot. The investigator told Hoole that this footage he was about to see was from a different security camera, which was positioned on the other side of the parking lot from where the dump truck was parked. And then when he hit play, he directed Hoole's attention to one particular car pulling into the parking lot. Now, the angle on this car was much closer, so there was a lot more detail visible than in the first video. And as Hoole watched, he saw what clearly was a young woman get out of the passenger seat and walk toward the store. Hoole leaned in close and squinted, and he realized he knew this woman because it was Jack's own daughter, Megan. Later that day, Hoole walked into an interrogation room in the Derry police station, where Megan was waiting for him. When Hoole walked in, he made a point to shake her hand and smile, acting as friendly and sympathetic as possible. He did not want to let on that he was looking at her as a suspect, so he didn't mention that they had video of her in the same parking lot where Jack's body was found, just a day before they found it. But as they started talking, Megan actually brought it up herself, that she happened to have been in the exact same lot that her father was ultimately found in. She said she had been shocked when she found out, one, that her father was dead, of course, but also that he was dumped in that Target lot. She had been there recently. She said her boyfriend Walter's sister lived in Saugus, and they had visited her for the 4th of July in an attempt to get their mind off their father's disappearance because at the time, he had not been found yet. Megan said they had unexpectedly decided to spend the night there, so they had driven to the nearest Target to get a contacts case. And when she said that, she just shook her head and said she couldn't believe her dad had basically been right there. She was so close to him. Hoole had to admit, this story did not sound totally crazy. After all, in the security video, Megan didn't go anywhere near the actual part of the lot where Jack's truck was parked. But still, he had a hard time believing that this was just one big coincidence, especially because when he was reviewing what Megan had told the police when she had first reported her father missing, he realized that she had said she last saw her dad on the night of Monday, June 27th, when she and her boyfriend Walter had gone to his place to pick up an air conditioner. But now, Hool knew that was impossible because the security video showed that Jack was already dead in the parking lot on the night of June 27th. So during this interview with Megan, Hool asked Megan again, when was the last time you saw your father? And once again, without missing a beat, she said it was the night of June 27th. Hool asked her if she was positive about the date, and she said yes, absolutely. So, without tipping his hand that he felt like for sure Megan was lying here, Hool let her go and immediately called in her boyfriend Walter, who had been waiting in the hallway. According to Megan, Walter was the one who actually drove her to that target in Saugus. Hool wanted to question the couple separately so he could see if there were any contradictions in their stories. But when he spoke to Walter, Walter repeated the exact same things Megan had said about why they were in the area and why they went to that target, to get a context case. Walter also included the detail about the last time they saw Jack being the night of the 27th. So basically, Walter and Megan's stories are the same. But to Hool, the only thing he thought when he heard this consistency is that clearly what's happened here is Megan and Walter have rehearsed this story because it is their alibi. But they don't realize there was time-stamped security footage that would contradict it. The following afternoon, Hool sat at his desk, combing through a copy of Jack's phone records. He'd sent officers out that morning to interview all of Megan's family and friends to see if they knew anything that could really help them pin the blame on Megan. And they'd quickly learned that Megan and Walter had moved in together recently, and Jack did not approve. So Hool began to wonder, maybe the young couple might have killed Jack so he would stay out of their way. Now, Megan at some point here found out from her friends who were being spoken to that clearly Megan was being investigated. And Megan had already called Hool to revise her testimony. She was now claiming that actually the last time she saw her dad was on the night of the 26th, not the 27th. But Hool didn't buy that she and Walter had both made the same mistake about the date. They both seemed really confident when they said 27th. And so Hool was hoping that if he could just retrace Jack's steps on the day of his death, he'd find some proof that Megan and Walter were somehow involved. Hool had already called around to check on the last scheduled job in Jack's logbook, which was on the morning of June 27th. And that client had confirmed that Jack was definitely there, and security footage from the local dump had shown Jack dropping off the trash afterwards around 2 p.m. But that left about a 3-hour gap on the afternoon of June 27th where Jack's whereabouts were unaccounted for. And really, Jack had to have been killed sometime in that window. So now Hool hoped that Jack's phone records might help him figure out where Jack went after leaving the dump that afternoon. Hool had been able to match most of the phone numbers that Jack dialed or received calls from to contacts in Jack's logbook, except for one. On the morning of June 27th, he had gotten a call from a number that wasn't anywhere in his contacts list. And at 2:07 that afternoon, while Jack was finishing up at the dump and just a few hours before his dead body was left in a Target parking lot, he'd gotten a second call from that same number. And so now, Hool called that number, but it went straight to voicemail. So he called the cell provider and asked them to look up who this number belonged to. And he found out it was registered to a man named Charlie Waz. And suddenly, something clicked in Hool's mind. And so he reached over and he grabbed Jack's logbook and he flipped to the page where Jack had scribbled down that address, 145 North Road, and also the name Charlie. This Charlie may be the same Charlie who called from that unknown number. And also, this Charlie may have been the last person to see Jack alive. Or maybe Charlie was the one who killed him. The cell provider employee also told Hool that that number came from a prepaid phone, the kind you can buy at a convenience store and load minutes onto without signing up for a long-term contract, and that it had been activated on June 19th, just 8 days before Jack's murder. Hool asked the worker to send over a full copy of the prepaid phone calls records, and then they hung up. Then Hool logged onto the police database and looked up the name Charlie Waz, but he didn't find anything. No criminal records or driver's licenses or car registrations. And so Hool had a feeling that this had to be a fake name, that there was no Charlie Waz. And what seemed to confirm that even further was when he looked up that address, the 145 North Road that was in the book next to the word Charlie. There was no Charlie affiliated with that property at all. The owner of 145 North Road was somebody called Michael Connors, but that name didn't mean anything to Hool, and it certainly wasn't Charlie. So Hool stood up from his desk and he grabbed his car keys. It was time to go talk with whoever actually lived at 145 North Road. Less than an hour later, Detective Hoole pulled onto a gravel driveway at 145 North Road, the address of the secluded farm scribbled in Jack Reed's logbook. He parked his car and he walked up to the big white house and he rang the doorbell. And the middle-aged man who answered the door seemed very calm and composed, until Hoole showed him his badge. Then the man started acting really jumpy. As they stood in the doorway, Hoole asked the man if he was Michael Connors, and the man nodded and said yes. Hoole asked if he knew a man named Jack Reed, and Michael quickly said no. And when Hoole asked why his address was in Jack Reed's logbook, Michael stammered out that he didn't know. It seemed fairly obvious to Hoole already that Michael clearly knew more than he was admitting to. And so he asked Michael where he'd been on the afternoon of June 27th. And Michael, very nervously and very quickly, said that he had spent all day doing repair work at a friend's lake house 30 miles away, and he didn't get home until late that night. And then he gave Hoole the names of a few other contractors who were also working on these repairs, who could verify his alibi. So Hoole, without giving off how suspicious he felt of this guy, wrote down the contractors' names and contact information, and then, as calm as could be, he asked Michael if he could take a look around, both inside his house and outside. Michael, who looked pretty resigned at this point, nodded and said yes, and then he stepped aside. And so Hoole walked into the house and began walking from room to room. But he didn't see any blood or anything really obviously suspicious. But then he went outside and he found this muddy path that led over to the barn, which was only a short distance from the main house. And when he reached the barn, he opened up the heavy wooden door and sunlight flooded in. Hoole stepped inside and right away he was struck by how neat it was in here. He began looking behind the hay bales and he shined his flashlights in the corners and he bent down to examine the dirt and the straw on the ground, but it was like the barn was spotless. Almost like the barn had recently been cleaned really thoroughly. When Hoole was done in the barn, he went outside and walked back towards the main house. And as he did, he saw Michael standing by the back door, staring right at him, like he had been really watching him closely as he was over at the barn. And so Hoole walked over to Michael, and very calmly, he asked him one last question. Did he know anyone named Megan Reed? And Michael said no, but the way he said it was noticeably less anxious, as if, for really the first time, he was telling the truth here. After that, as Hoole walked back to his car to leave, he thought that even though he hadn't found any hard evidence at this farm, Michael's weird behavior seemed to be saying a lot. Later that day, Hoole hung up the phone in his office, feeling very frustrated. He called every single one of those contractors who Michael had given him, and they had all confirmed his alibi. Michael had been doing repairs at his friend's house, 30 miles away, at the time of Jack's death. So Hoole figured that, Michael couldn't have been directly involved in the murder, but based on his very suspicious behavior, it seemed like he probably knew something had happened on his property, maybe while he was away. And this gave Hoole something to work with, because it could mean that at least one of Jack's 3 or more killers was close enough with Michael that Michael was willing to lie to protect them. But that was about all he had to work with. There was no obvious link between Michael Connors and Jack's daughter Megan and her boyfriend Walter, who were still really his only real suspects. And so he was starting to think that maybe he'd been looking in the wrong direction, and that Megan and Walter maybe weren't involved after all. It was still only a few days into the investigation, and there were plenty of other potential suspects to dig into, like Jack's ex-partners and his adult children from his first relationship and all the other clients in his logbook. But just then, Hoole's fax machine whirred to life. The cell provider was finally sending over the call records from Charlie's prepaid phone. Once it was done printing, Hoole ripped the sheet out of the machine and began looking over the call log. The phone had only been activated a week before Jack's murder, and it hadn't been used at all since the evening Jack was killed. And every single call that had been made or received on that phone was to Jack's number, except for one. And when Hoole looked into the owner of that one other number, everything about the case began to fall into place. Based on those phone records, as well as interviews with the various suspects, this is what police believe happened to Jack Reed on June 27th, 2005. That afternoon, while Jack's dump truck was pulling into the gravel driveway at 145 North Road, 2 of Jack's killers were inside of that house waiting for him. One of them was sitting on the couch, nervously tapping their feet, and then that killer looked up and saw their accomplice staring right at them, looking very annoyed, like, "Stop tapping your feet." And so they did. But just then, the doorbell rang. The calmer of the 2 killers walked over to answer it, while the more nervous one stayed on the couch. And the nervous one, they listened as the door opened, and they could hear the sound of their accomplice greeting Jack, and then a few seconds later, Jack walked into the living room. And the nervous killer, when they saw Jack, they kind of jumped to their feet and tried to act natural, but very likely they were acting incredibly nervous. But after a sort of awkward conversation between all 3 of them, they left the main house and they walked down that dirt path towards the barn. As they walked, the killer, who'd been very nervous, sort of hung back, walking a few steps behind Jack. And then as they got close to the barn, their heart began to pound. I mean, they'd rehearsed this a dozen times and they knew exactly what they had to do. But actually doing it was going to be the hard part. Then the doors to the barn opened up, and inside, Jack would have seen there were 2 more people waiting for him. But before Jack could react, the nervous killer leapt forward and tackled Jack to the ground. And then a second later, the nervous killer heard a loud thump and looked up to see one of their accomplices standing above them, holding a hammer that was now dripping with blood. The nervous killer climbed to their feet and looked down at Jack, who was now lying on the floor of the barn with a gaping hole in the side of his skull. It was so gruesome that the nervous killer had to go outside and vomit. And then when they came back inside, the other 3 had unrolled this big piece of plastic on the floor of the barn, and they were placing Jack's body in the center of it. Blood was still pouring out of his head, pooling into this big red puddle on the plastic. I mean, it was so awful. Then one of the killers grabbed the bloody hammer and said that if they could just stop Jack's heart, it would stop the bleeding. And so they raised the hammer and began pounding on Jack's chest. And after that, the bleeding did slow down, and the 4 killers worked together to wrap Jack's body in the plastic. Then, once he was all wrapped up, they carried him outside and loaded his body into the back of his own dump truck. The killer who had first answered the door, the calmer of the killers, got in the driver's seat of the dump truck. And the nervous killer, the one who had been tapping their foot, the one who had initially tackled Jack to the ground, they climbed into the passenger seat. The other 2, the ones who had been waiting in the barn, climbed into a minivan, and they followed behind them as they drove all the way across state lines to Saugus, Massachusetts, more than an hour away. When they finally got to Saugus, they pulled into the first major parking lot they came across, a Target store. They parked the dump truck near the back of the lot, and then when they got out, the nervous killer double-checked the tarp to make sure it was secure, and then they, along with their calmer accomplice, walked across the lot to the white minivan, and they climbed inside. After that, all 4 killers drove all the way back to New Hampshire to clean up the barn, because the farm's owner, Michael Connors, expected it to be left in perfect condition. Now, Michael Connors, the owner of the barn, was not directly involved in the murder scheme. However, he did know that the mastermind of the murder was going to be using his property while he was gone. However, he would testify that he did not know what they were doing and just asked that they keep it clean when he got back. Ultimately, the reason he allowed his property to be used at all is because he was doing a favor to the mastermind of the murder, who was his longtime friend and business partner, and also the very same self-made Las Vegas millionaire that Jack Reed himself had viewed as this big success story, whose path in life Jack was hoping to emulate. The millionaire's name was John Brooks, and he believed that when Jack had helped him move, it was a job he had done for him a few years back, that Jack, during that move, had stolen some of his motorcycles and jewelry. Now, there was no evidence to actually back this up, but John Brooks was convinced, and he held a grudge. So in retaliation, a few months after the move, Brooks had sent his son Jesse to Jack's home to scare him. That's who Jack had spotted in the middle of the night on his property almost 2 years ago, the strange prowler who had literally called out to Jack by name. But when Jack came outside to confront him and literally fired a gun at Jesse, Jesse and his dad did not stop what they were doing. Instead, Brooks only got angrier, and he vowed to get revenge. So he'd sent 4 people out to New Hampshire to kill Jack. It was his son Jesse, Jesse's friend Michael Benton, who was not the same as the Michael who owned the farm, and the 2 other men who were named Joseph Vrooman and Robin Knight. All 5 men were eventually convicted of taking part in the murder. John Brooks was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Robin Knight was also sentenced to life. Michael Benton, not Michael Connors, the owner of the barn, so Michael Benton, got 33 years to life. Joseph Vrooman was sentenced to between 17 and 35 years, and Jesse Brooks was sentenced to 15 to 30 years. He was released on parole in 2023. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Gallagher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 stories about acts so strange and unsettling, they blur the line between devotion and madness. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Exit Interviews, and it's about one of the most infamous cult cases in history. The second story you'll hear is called A Family Ritual, and it's about a sickening act a family performs together. Keep in mind, for this story, listener discretion is advised. And the third and final story you'll hear is called The Helping Hand. And in this story, a literal hand washes up on a beach in Florida, after which a very mysterious case begins to unravel. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload 4 times a week: Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Fridays. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a nice peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But make sure you employ a 6-to-1 peanut butter to jelly ratio. Okay, let's get into our first story called Exit Interviews.
In the early 1970s, a man named Marshall Applewhite was fired from his music teaching job for having an inappropriate relationship with a male student. Shortly after, he admitted himself into a psychiatric institution where he met a nurse who worked there named Bonnie Nettles. Both had a deep interest in biblical prophecy, and Applewhite, after meeting Nettles, was convinced they had met in a previous life. Nettles agreed and took it a step further, saying extraterrestrials had come to her and preordained that she would someday meet Applewhite. The two did not have a romantic relationship at all. It was strictly platonic. They bonded over a desire to ascend to a higher level of existence and ultimately reach the kingdom of heaven. Applewhite began calling himself Bo, and Nettles became Peep, and together they would start an infamous cult known as Heaven's Gate. The premise of Heaven's Gate was that an alien spacecraft that they simply called the UFO was going to come to Earth and whisk away Heaven's Gate cult members, elevating them to a new world and a better life that they referred to as Tela, or the evolutionary level above human. There was a catch though. Anybody on Earth who did not get on the UFO whenever it got here would be recycled, i.e. destroyed, along with everybody else on Earth, and then at some point a new human population would grow, and another UFO would come, and whoever got on that would be saved over and over and over again. That was just how it worked. And Bo and Peep were telling everyone they talked to about Heaven's Gate that we're already in end times. Apparently there were signs that this UFO is going to be here any day. And so now is the time to join the cult. And so by 1975, Bo and Peep had recruited 20 people to be a part of their cult, which meant they gave up their families, they gave up their possessions, they basically gave up everything in their life and moved to Colorado to live in total poverty as they waited for this UFO to arrive. For 10 years, cult members waited and waited for this UFO that never showed up. And Bo and Peep are aggressively reminding people that this is the path, you just gotta stay the path. And then Peep unexpectedly died of cancer in 1985, which really screwed things up for the cult. In their doctrine, it was destiny that Bo and Peep would get on that UFO and make their way to Tela, the evolutionary level above human. That was their destiny. And now Peep has died on planet Earth. She did not get on the UFO. She did not ascend to Tela. She will not get to Heaven's Gate. Bo was devastated and horribly depressed, and it wasn't really clear what was going to happen to Heaven's Gate. But he composed himself and he began to tweak his messaging a little bit. Bo began telling his followers that Peep had in fact ascended to Tela. Yes, she did not get on the UFO. However, the aliens must have given her a signal that if she leaves behind this human body, this mere vessel, you'll still ascend to Tela. Basically, he was preaching to them, if you just end your own life at the right moment, you can go to Tela too. But Bo didn't really know what the right moment was. He didn't know what the trigger was going to be. Until 1995, when astronomers discovered the Hale-Bopp comet was going to be passing by Earth 2 years later in 1997. And Bo saw this as the trigger. The UFO was going to be hiding behind the trail of this comet, and for sure, Peep was riding on that UFO, and as soon as it passes by Earth, we need to ascend. And so fast forward to March 26, 1997, as the Hale-Bopp comet passed by Earth, 39 of the Heaven's Gate cult members, including Bo, they began their journey. Bo told them they would be exiting the Earth in 3 groups. And so on March 26th, Group 1 entered their San Diego mansion and consumed applesauce mixed with barbiturates, followed it up with a whole bunch of vodka, and then put a bag over their head and waited for death. Then on March 27th, Group 2 entered the San Diego mansion, knowing full well what they were walking into. They all had specific jobs of how they were going to clean up the mess left from Group 1. They cleaned it up. Then they picked up the Group 1 members and placed them in beds and put a purple cloth over their face before they, Group 2, consumed their own applesauce mixed with barbiturates and put a bag over their head and waited for death. On March 28th, the 3rd group entered the San Diego mansion, and this included Bo, and they did the same cleanup as Group 2. They put the Group 2 deceased members in bed as well, and then they consumed applesauce and barbiturates, followed it up with vodka, bag over their head, waited for death. Bo had given special instructions to 2 of the members that were within that 3rd group to wait until he had exited Earth and take special care to put him in a specific bed, organized a certain way, and then when they consumed their own applesauce and barbiturates followed up with vodka, they should do that in their bed because they're the last 2. There's nobody else to move them. When a former cult member stopped by the San Diego mansion to check in on the cult, they went inside not knowing what they were up to and found all 39 cult members deceased, laying in bunk beds with identical black and white Nike running shoes on their feet with purple shrouds over their bodies, and they were all wearing matching armbands that read Heaven's Gate Away Team. Just hours before they exited the Earth, each of the groups would perform exit interviews where they would record themselves talking about why they were doing this, why it was important, and what they expected on the other side. They are remarkably cheerful and happy considering what they all know they are about to do. Here are some highlights from those exit interviews.
Okay, we have Thursody with us, and I believe that you chose the name Thursody because you want to be reminded of your thirst for next level knowledge. Is that correct?
That's right. I know my vehicle's, or this vehicle that I'm wearing is, pretty nervous, pretty scared. Some may say, well, boy, it's quite a irreversible step.
this isn't a troubling circumstance. Don't take it as that. It's just a gateway, just a doorway.
Okay, thank you.
Now you're going to find this old crummy vehicle in a bunk someplace that I'll be going. I'll probably be watching when you check it out and observe your responses and your reaction when you look at these vehicles. And they're all nothing but containers that we've used and borrowed for the short amount of time.
People in the world who thought that I had completely lost my marbles. They're not right.
Our next story is called A Family Ritual. On April 9th, 2005, in Kaohsiung City, Taiwan, a young man was home alone inside of his apartment watching TV. And as he sat there watching TV, he heard a loud thumping sound coming from right above him. As soon as he heard it, he muted his TV and he listened for a second, and a minute later, he heard it again, a loud thump. And then he heard another one, and another one, and another one, and before long, all he heard was a succession of thumps and also what sounded like chanting coming from upstairs. However, as unusual as these types of sounds might be to the average person, to this young man, these actually weren't that weird. Because the family that lived right above him, the Wu family, were pretty eccentric. They were very religious people who often did these ceremonial dances and rituals at all hours, and a lot of times they involved stomping around and chanting really loudly. And as annoying as that could be, this young man never complained. He was very respectful of the Wu family, and he knew, these sounds he was hearing were connected to their religion, and he felt like that was none of his business. And so, like he did basically every other time he would hear these noises, he simply turned the volume up on his TV and tried to forget about them. But after a few minutes, it was like the noises coming from upstairs just kept getting louder and louder and louder until it was basically impossible to ignore. And then suddenly he heard a scream coming from upstairs that certainly did not feel attached to a ceremony. It sounded like somebody was in danger or in trouble or something. And so at that point, the young man turned the TV off and he stood up and he thought, I need to go up there and make sure things are okay. I mean, forget being annoyed. It sounds like, someone's in trouble or someone's hurt or something. But as he began making his way towards his door to go upstairs and check on the Wu family, all the noises just completely stopped and it was silent upstairs. And at that point, the young man just stopped where he was. And for a minute, he just listened, waiting to see if maybe the noises would pick back up again. But they didn't. And so the young man just turned around, walked back to his seat, and turned the TV back on. 2 days later, on April 11th, that same young man was back home all alone, watching TV yet again, when, once again, he heard a loud pounding sound. Except this time, it was not coming from upstairs, it was coming from his front door. Somebody was hammering on his front door trying to get his attention. And so the young man turned off the TV, he got up, and he went over to his door, he opened it up, and standing there on the landing was this middle-aged man named Wu Shan, who was the patriarch of the Wu family upstairs. And Wu Shan looked absolutely horrible. He was dressed all in black head to toe, but he was pale and skinny and very gaunt, and he was covered in what looked like filth, like food and ash, and he smelled unbelievably horrible. And the young man, he asked Wu Shan, hey, is everything okay? And remember, the young man's thinking about that crazy, loud ceremony they had just 2 days earlier, wondering, whatever happened with that. That was so loud. But Wu Shan just looked back at the young man with this kind of vacant expression, and he just said, call an ambulance. And then, without saying anything else, Wu Shan turned, ran down the steps, and disappeared out into the street. And so at this point, the young man is left just standing there having no idea what to think. I mean, Wu Shan did not look well and he's now run away. And again, this young man is thinking about that bizarre ritual he overheard a couple of days ago that just kind of stopped abruptly after screams were heard. Now he's being told to call an ambulance. And so he's thinking, I better go upstairs and make sure things are okay before I do anything else. And so the young man left his apartment, went upstairs to the Wu family's apartment, and the door was shut. But even standing outside the door, he began to smell that same absolutely horrible smell that he smelled on Wu Shan. So he knocks on the Wu family's door, he's kind of covering his nose, but he doesn't get a response, nobody comes to the door. And so after looking around, he just tried the doorknob and he found it was unlocked. So, pretty apprehensively, but knowing he needed to see what was going on here, he opened up the door, and right away he's hit with another wave of just this disgusting smell. He can barely breathe, but nonetheless, he steps into the house and he calls out to anybody, anyone come over here and tell me what's going on, but nobody called back. And he kind of looked around the family's apartment and it was totally filthy. There was just this grime all over everything, and he made his way all the way into the living room, and there he stopped. Because in the middle of the living room on the floor, he saw something that he just simply couldn't believe. It would turn out the Wu family had performed a ritual 2 days earlier. That was the sounds that the neighbor downstairs had been hearing. Those loud stomping and screaming, all that stuff was a ceremony like the family was known to do. However, that ceremony got totally out of hand. So in the weeks leading up to that ceremony, one of the Wu family's daughters came down with an illness, and because the family didn't have a lot of money, they couldn't send her to the doctor. And after a couple of days, when she didn't get better, the family decided that, okay, well, she must not be physically sick. She must be spiritually sick, meaning she was possessed by a demon. And so at first, they tried some ceremonies to ward off this demon, but it wasn't really working. And then before long, the rest of the members of the family began complaining that maybe they too were also possessed by the same demon. And before long, that was the belief that the entire Wu family shared, that they all were possessed by demons. And so on the day the downstairs neighbor heard all that stomping and chanting and screaming, that was the day that the Wu family performed a big group exorcism to try to get rid of these demons once and for all from all of them. But the way they did this exorcism was truly horrifying. They believed that the one thing demons were afraid of was filth. And so they decided that if they filled their bodies with enough filth, the demons would leave. And so the Wu family, as they chanted and stomped around and screamed, began consuming their own feces. And when they would vomit it back up again, they would just swallow it right back down for hours and hours and hours. What the downstairs neighbor actually discovered inside the living room of the Wu family's apartment was the daughter, the one who originally had gotten sick, and she was laying on the ground and was deceased. And during the autopsy, they would discover that her airway was totally blocked by feces and vomit. By the time the downstairs neighbor made this discovery, the entire Wu family had fled the apartment. Wu Shan had disappeared after saying calling an ambulance, and the rest of the family too had kind of run off. But the police would ultimately track down all the remaining Wu family members, and they would all be arrested. However, a court ultimately decided that the Wu family was suffering from something known as mass hysteria. And as a result of that, they could not be held legally accountable for what they did. And so they were all acquitted. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Helping Hand. One morning in November of 1997, a police captain named Jeffrey Lewis, along with his partner, parked their squad car near the Manatee River in Bradenton, Florida, which is a small city just south of Tampa. A few minutes earlier, the Bradenton Police Department had received a call from this frantic man who had said he had found something suspicious that had washed up on the shore of this river. And so Captain Lewis and his partner were there to investigate. And so as soon as they got out of their squad car, this man who had called the police, he saw them and waved them down, and he was pointing at something in the sand. And so Captain Lewis and his partner, they walked over, and before they even talked to this guy, they just looked down at what he was pointing at, and right away they could see why he called the police. Because there, sitting on the sand, was a severed human hand. And so the instant Captain Lewis saw this, his first thought was actually just alligators. Because there were alligators that swam in the Manatee River, and people were told about them and were told, not to go swimming here, but people still did. And so his thought was, well, maybe one of the alligators got a swimmer. However, when Captain Lewis looked at the hand more closely, he could tell right away that that probably did not happen. Because where the hand had been cut off from the body, the cut was almost surgical. It was very, very neat. Whereas if an alligator had ripped the hand off, it would be rough. But this almost looked like a surgeon had carefully removed the hand. And so what this signaled to Captain Lewis is this hand very likely represented a murder victim. Somebody who killed this person cut their body up, and, one of their body parts is now washed ashore. And so Captain Lewis turned to his partner and told him to call for backup. And within an hour, police officers were scouring the Manatee River looking for the body that belonged to this hand. Meanwhile, the captain bagged this hand as evidence and brought it to the county sheriff's crime lab, hoping that forensic experts could potentially figure out who the victim was using fingerprints. However, when he actually handed over the hand to these forensic technicians, they told Captain Lewis that it was very likely going to be impossible to try to pull prints from this hand because the hand was very badly decomposed and water damaged. But they told Captain Lewis that despite this being a total long shot, they would still give it a try. And so really all Captain Lewis had was this hand, and so he just kind of waited for information from the crime lab about the fingerprints. And before long, the waiting went from days to weeks to months with no fingerprints. And so with no fingerprints and no other breakthroughs in this case, Captain Lewis moved on to other cases. That is until June of 1998, when Captain Lewis was sitting in his office doing some work, when he suddenly got a call from the crime lab about the hand. An employee told Captain Lewis they had finally made a breakthrough. When they couldn't get the prints off this hand at first, they had moved to this very complicated technique where basically they would peel individual layers of skin off the hand and sort of piece together all the information to get a print. And amazingly, this technique worked. And so not only did they now have this print, but they had also already run this print through the Florida State database and they had gotten a match. The hand belonged to a man named Willie Suttle. As soon as he hung up, Captain Lewis opened up a new tab on his computer and began researching Willie Suttle to figure out who this person was. And he quickly found through public employment records that Willie had been a retired garbage collector, and then also Captain Lewis looked at police records and discovered that Willie had a minor criminal history. But what really stood out in his research about Willie was that Willie had never been reported missing. Willie had instead been reported dead. Right there in the public records that Captain Lewis was looking at, he found Willie's death certificate. And this document said Willie had died of natural causes 5 months prior to his hand washing up on shore. And also it said Willie had been buried in a local cemetery and no police had ever been involved in his death because no crime had been committed. And so Captain Lewis was baffled. None of this made any sense. If Willie had died of natural causes and been buried over a year ago, then how did his hand, his severed hand, wind up on the shore of the Manatee River? The next day, which was Friday, June 26th, Captain Lewis, along with a few other police officers, went to the cemetery where Willie had been buried, and they exhumed his casket. And when they opened it up, they actually expected it to be empty, considering his hand was already missing, so probably his whole body was gone. But no, when they opened it up, there was Willie missing his left hand. But that wasn't all. At the bottom of Willie's casket were all of his internal organs, just sitting there in a rotting pile. And so Captain Lewis is staring at this, having no idea what to make of it, but the first thought he had was, okay, maybe somebody tried to rob Willie's casket. But he's thinking, if they did that, why did they cut out his organs and stash him at the bottom of the casket? And also, why did they remove his left hand and chuck it in the river? That doesn't make any sense. It felt like every clue Captain Lewis found was only making this case harder to solve. But he hoped when he sent off Willie's body to the county medical examiner that they would be able to provide him with some more answers as to what happened here. Later that afternoon, the county medical examiner would perform an autopsy on Willie's body. And the first thing he noticed when he began was that despite the fact that Willie's organs clearly had been removed, that Willie's abdomen did not appear sunken in. It appeared full. So the medical examiner started the autopsy by cutting open Willie's abdomen to see what was in there. And when he saw what was inside of Willie, he just froze, having no idea how to react to what he was looking at. He had never seen anything like this in his entire career, not even close. And so the medical examiner just grabbed a camera, took some pictures of Willie's midsection, and sent those pictures to Captain Lewis. The next day, Captain Lewis sat inside of an interview room in the police station across from a 45-year-old woman named Paula Green Albritton. Paula owned and operated a funeral home along with the help of her son, and she had been the one responsible for Willie Suttle's burial. And so Captain Lewis asked Paula about Willie's burial, and she would tell him that Willie had actually died in poverty, without any family members to help cover his burial expenses. However, when Paula had found out about this, she said she had agreed to do the burial anyways, for no cost, as sort of a community service. However, when Captain Lewis poked and prodded and tried to ask for more information about exactly what that meant, Paula would eventually concede that there actually was slightly more to her rationale behind wanting to do Willie's burial. It was not just for charity. 2 days after this interview, police arrested both Paula and her son. And at Paula's trial, the truth surrounding what happened to Willie finally came out. It would turn out Paula's funeral home business was really struggling, to the point where if she couldn't start generating some real money, her business might go under, and she couldn't have that. And so Paula decided she would conduct a prosperity ritual to right her business. But to perform this prosperity ritual, Paula needed a body. And so along comes Willie Suttle, who's died in poverty and his family can't afford his funeral, and Paula says, "Don't worry, I'll take him on for free." But really what she needed was Willie's body. And once Paula and her son had possession of Willie's body, they began the ritual, which started with Paula's son carefully cutting off Willie's left hand, and then the two of them cut Willie's midsection open, removed all his internal organs, and then Paula got out all these voodoo dolls, and she wrote on pieces of paper the names of the other funeral homes, her competitors in the area, and she pinned these pieces of paper to each of these voodoo dolls, and then she took those voodoo dolls and jammed them inside of Willie's abdomen in the empty cavity they had created, and then they stitched him back up. And then she took Willie's body and his organs and she chucked them into a cheap casket and had him buried. And then she also took the hand that her son had removed, she put it inside of a plastic bag, added some weight to it, and chucked it into the Manatee River. Paula believed this voodoo ritual would literally cause the owners of the other funeral homes, whose businesses she wrote down on the dolls and jammed inside of Willie's body, that this ritual would literally cause all of them to be struck down and killed, putting their businesses out of business, thereby leading to her business prospering once again. However, none of these things came to fruition. The ritual did not work the way Paula intended it to. Instead, the hand that she had thrown into the river ultimately washed ashore, and before long, the police figured out what Paula and her son had done. In 1999, so 2 years after Willie's hand had washed up on shore, Paula and her son were found guilty of desecrating Willie's corpse. Paula's son ultimately served 1 year in prison. As for Paula, her conviction was actually quickly overturned due to a technicality. It was discovered that during an interview with Paula, that police detectives told her that she could not be convicted if this ritual was part of a religious practice, that she was protected under the US Constitution. And so Paula, who confessed to doing this ritual, did so by saying it was part of her religion. She practiced voodoo. And so in court, that confession was ruled inadmissible. And so she walked free.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
Let me ask you a question, John. If I told you right now to walk up to any one of these books, now not physically, but mentally, and I want you to flip it open to any page, to look at that page, and to go back and forth and stop at any word, can you see this happening? Close your eyes, and in your mind's eye, envision that occurring. I want to show them at home because people will say later that I changed what I wrote somehow.
All right.
Open your eyes. What was that word?
Hell, dude. This is not staged. This is crazy. I'm blown away. All right, welcome back to Storytime with MrBallen. This was such a hit on the last episode with Tom Segura that we decided we would do more. And today's guest, I got to be honest, they're going to blow your mind. Seriously, I went into this experience sort of skeptical. I mean, the things this person does are sort of impossible. I mean, he goes in front of these audiences, which include huge celebrities and professional sports teams, and effectively reads their minds. He certainly blows their minds, and he does it under so much pressure, and he nails it every time. And so we asked him on the show. He's got some amazing stories, and he also truly I have something written on my hand right now that has to do with one of the tricks that he pulled on me, and it's just I can't believe how this episode went. So really stick around. He's an amazing guy and just a master of his craft. He's going to blow your mind. So without further ado, let's get into today's episode.
I'm Oz the Mentalist. I'm here in Storytime with MrBallen. I already know what you're thinking. Stick around.
All right, Oz the Mentalist Perlman.
Yeah.
So you are the world's greatest mentalist. I mean, lately I have seen you pop up all over the place. You were just on Joe Rogan and his reaction to when he guesses his
Pissed
ATM.
off. Joe, you have not seen him that angry in a while. You know, he goes down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, and he was like, did you hack me? Have you literally gotten into my life? How did you get my PIN code?
I liked how you were like, hey, let's just be spontaneous. You're like, look, I'm gonna try to guess your ATM PIN code. And you could just see it on Joe. He's like, okay, all right, let's see. And you guessed the first number at some point. You're like, just tell me, is it 1? I think it was 1.
Yep.
And he's like, all right. But then as soon as you began doing it, you could just see his whole mentality, everything shifted. And you can just see as the audience, if this is staged, it's the best staging I've ever seen, because his reaction was not pleasure. It was like, stop.
How'd I do, Joe? Is that your ATM PIN code?
Yeah. That's weird. I'm skeptical because I've got that PIN code in the mail. You know?
People loved seeing it because with Joe, he is the ultimate debunker.
Yeah.
Are we in agreement? Like, no one's going on Joe Rogan and telling Joe what to do.
No.
On the biggest platform in the world, that he is the boss, and he didn't know what was going to happen. And I think that's what captivated the public. Is if he would have been amazed, that's one thing, but he was angry and a little scared.
So tell me, like, what is a mentalist?
Right.
Because I've looked it up.
Yeah.
But that doesn't really accomplish the task here. I want to hear from you. And secondarily, how does one know they have the skill to be a mentalist?
So a mentalist is a form of magic, right?
Okay.
This is not in the world of psychics and supernatural. That's not what I pretend to do. I completely make sure that I go out of my way to ensure people understand I'm not claiming to be a psychic. I'm not supernatural. Instead, I have a series of skills that I've developed, kind of like an arsenal of tools over decades of learning how people think, and it's grounded in magic. So everyone knows what a magician is, right? You could go to an 8-year-old, they've started to see magic tricks. And when we watch magic, we understand that we're being fooled with our eyes. Somehow this person knows how to do things quickly or to distract me so they do something somewhere else, right? When you cut the woman in half, spoiler alert, guys, I'm not trying to ruin Christmas. There's no Santa Claus. You're not really cutting the woman in half. Somehow you're deceiving me with an illusion. That's the name of the word. That's really what it's called. So magic is all about misdirection and fooling the eyes. This is a specialized subset within magic where it's magic of the mind. Very different. I'm not fooling your eyes because there's no fast hands. There's almost no props. I can show up. I had a show last night in Toronto, came right here from the airport where I did a show. It was a smaller group, about 400 people. And I show up with nothing. I have a pad of paper and a marker, which if I don't have with me, they can grab for me.
Yeah.
The show isn't props. I'm the show. And so what I've learned to do is know how people think. And by knowing effectively how people think, I'll know what they think. and I'll present that in a very entertaining, fooling, and hopefully memorable manner. So mentalism is psychology, misdirection, deception, influence. It's all these different skills baked into one cake.
And is this something that you always knew you possessed, some skills that ultimately crystallized and became you being the world's greatest mentalist?
Right. Thank you.
Did you have moments in your life before this became a thing where you're like, I have these innate skills that I could refine, but you knew you had them? Or is this something that people could be taught?
Absolutely, people can be taught. So this is a learnable skill, but I would liken it to musical talent, which is innate in a sense, which is you could probably learn to play the piano and do a certain number of songs. Like my 9-year-old plays the piano. If I continued practicing every day for a year, I'd probably get better. But what if I practiced for a decade? Would I ever be good enough to play at Carnegie Hall in New York City? I don't think I would. I think that it's not in me, that innate, God-given gift, whatever you want to call it. You can develop the skills, but when you get to a certain level, there might be a ceiling.
Sure.
So that's the best way to describe it. I have a gift for it, and I've also been very, very persistent, and never underestimate the power of persistence, because mentalism has a steep learning curve, and most people don't have thick enough skin to get through the times when you suck. So magic can be practiced over and over and over in a mirror, and you can improve because it's move-based. It's kind of like playing golf. If you practice your swing, hopefully by the millionth swing, you're going to be great. You might not be Rory McIlroy or Tiger Woods. With this, the only way that I can get better is by doing it for an audience. Do you see what I mean? You can't practice guessing what people are going to think without people. And the first few 100 times you do it, you're going to eat, pardon my French, you're going to eat shit. Like you're not going to be good. There's very few mentalists that started good. And so what tends to happen is you perform, you suck, you go, oh my God, that was painful. I don't want to do that again. I don't want to experience that suffering. So I did much more magic for years. And then I started dipping my toes in the water of mentalism and then doing a little more and then doing a little more. And then I was on a show, if we like rewind my career, there was a moment where it was like a fork in the road where I was on America's Got Talent, of course, changed my life. And I rebranded myself as, instead of like, we quote unquote, O's the magician, I became O's the mentalist. That's how I literally monikered it, because now I differentiated myself from others and decided I'm not doing magic anymore. That was like the crutch. I just started doing just mentalism.
That's interesting. I think one of the things that I've noticed about you and your rise that's currently up and to the right, you really are killing it right now, is in a way, I feel like I can relate a little bit to the pressure that you put on yourself. And I'll give you some context. So I know that you're into distance running, in addition to like serious distance running. This dude's done like 153 miles.
It's true.
Regularly runs marathons on a whim. It is a physical feat, no doubt. But it is a mental feat more than anything else.
Agreed. It's more mental than physical. Anybody who tells me, I can't do this, I'm like, that you already set yourself up. I can't. You've already created an obstacle in your mind. It's the wrong viewpoint, and your mind translates into your body. So you telling yourself that creates that. I think, the mind controls the body. I've seen people that are 20, 30 years older than me finish a race that I didn't finish. Objectively, I'm fitter than they are. I'm younger than they are. I'm stronger than they are. Why did they finish when I didn't? Because my mind crumbled.
Yeah.
And you know it. I mean, buds, how many people rang that bell?
A lot.
That were probably tough SOBs, but they didn't have it mentally.
It's true. And in fact, you had said that when you first tried the Spartathlon, you did it twice, right?
I did it twice.
So the Spartathlon's 153 miles, right?
Yep, 153 miles, 36-hour cutoff. So it's very important. There's races that are longer. Right now, there's a heyday of people running 200-mile races, all this crazy stuff. But this, you can't slow down and walk very much. Like in these other races, they're glorified hikes. No offense to all these people that do 200s. They do it for 4 or 5 days.
Right.
Most of the people are, it's slow. This is running nonstop for a day and a half. You start on a Saturday morning, I'm running till Sunday evening.
That's insane.
Yeah.
And so like what people need to understand about running really long distances, I've done a couple marathons, and a marathon is 26.2 miles.
Which is very respectable.
Totally.
Don't you talk down on yourself.
But when you hit about mile 20, people say that's sort of like the halfway point, even though it's not. 26.2, the halfway is 13.
Right.
But at about 20 miles is when your body sort of reaches that point where it's like, okay, we've lost all the glucose stores. We're sort of burning on muscle at this point. It's like you're falling apart. And I remember when I ran a marathon and I hit mile 20, it was like, I can barely move and I have 6 miles to go.
Right.
So for anyone that's even thinking, 153 miles, you just suck it up and go. That's not how that works. This is like a mental test of magnitudes you may not understand, but you had said if the first time you did the Spartathlon, you did not finish.
Didn't finish.
And you knew as you're running along, you're like, I'm not going to finish this.
Right.
And you're writing the story in your head that you're like, how am I going to spin this to the people that, they expected me to finish and I didn't.
Yes.
But you went back and you ultimately did it again and you finished it. That's so highly unusual. One, that you went after it in the first place, but two, that you went back and did the race. I think that says a lot about not only your mental toughness, but why you have these innate skills. You've honed those skills to become the mentalist that you are, but you obviously have this ability to put yourself in these highly mentally stressful environments and perform not just well, but at your literal best.
Right.
And so, like, dude, you go in front of an entire NFL football team, and these are also clips you got to check out if you haven't seen them. Like the Bengals, you go
one of my favorites.
and like he'll tell the players, like the quarterback Joe Burrow, and he's like, I'm going to write down who you're going to throw it to, and I'm not going to show you. You're going to do it. Throw it to anybody in the room, and then after you do it, I'm going to show you what I thought. And like the clip, you see that he's written down a name, and sure enough, he turns, he throws the football, and everyone's like, oh, he guessed it right. But then the next time you do it, you write down two names, and it's like, he's going to fake to this person and throw to this person, and you're holding it back. And sure enough, Joe, who clearly has no idea what you've written down, fake, throw, room goes wild.
Tanner.
Fakes to Jamar, throws to Tanner.
How do you put yourself in that position consistently and just stay calm enough to do those things when the outcome's binary? That's so stressful. How do you do it?
So I think your mindset, and this is where the ultra running and the mentalism go hand in hand, and I think each one has improved the other. Truly, there's physiological things involved, which being able to be calm under pressure, that calmness directly creates the success in the situation, which is when you start panicking, those chemicals that flood through your body can indicate to other people the same way that animals can smell fear. They can literally smell fear. I think we still have that hardwired in us. We are still animals in a sense where we don't trust our instincts, but we can feel it. Like right now, if somebody walks in the room, even if you don't know that they're there, you have situational awareness where you can sense somebody walked in. How is that, right? It's not sonar. There's something in you that I don't know how we explain that's a sense that can indicate danger, which I'm sure you've had. You can sense on high alert and something floods you because that fight or flight. So in those situations where it's do or die, not literally, but if that screws up in that room, there's no safety net. This football team didn't walk in and get set up and say, hey guys, act excited for this random dude. No. Joe Burrow, the funny part about that clip was the day it dropped, the day before he signed the most lucrative contract in NFL history, $275 million with some obscene number that was guaranteed, like $184 million, fact check me. So the best comment, the comment that run up the most was dude, he clearly paid this guy to do it. And then my comment under to this guy was, bro, I wish I had enough money to pay Joe Burrow off to pretend to do this. And it got up like 10,000 times because it's so comical. It's like, how do you think? Right. The behind the scenes on that, by the way, is great because Joe is very shy. He's a great guy, but I had no time with him. And when you go to these football teams, there's a series of people that are intermediaries. Sure. I'm not talking to the players. No. There's the PR team, the communications team. These are organizations. And they say to you, that person doesn't want to be involved. And so I say to them, with all due respect, I'll see who wants to be involved. I say yes. But when I get in the room, my job is to convert no's into yeses, where some of the people that thought they wanted nothing to do with me, I'm going to win them over. And the Joe Burrow thing, yes, there was an amazing trick, but getting somebody who, when they sat down in their mind, said 100% no, I'm not getting involved. And then having them not only say yes to what I was going to do, buy in, but then have a monster reaction that's since been viewed hundreds of millions of times and helped change my life. That same thing, that set of skills on how to win people over, influence them, is applicable to everyone in every facet of your life. It works in business if you're doing sales. It works in relationships, whether it's people you know closely and you want to create deeper bonds, or whether it's people you want to win over, whether it's like a romantic sense, friendship sense. It's how do you meet people and connect with them in a deeper way and get them not only to like you, build rapport, but both of those two things are to do what you want them to do. Not in a nefarious way, but think about it. I'm a parent. I'm trying to win my kids over. I'm selling them all the time my ideas, which is please do your homework right now, even though you don't want to because there's better things to do. How do you convince them in an effective manner? And that is a form of mentalism, which is knowing how people think and using it to your advantage. That's what I'm doing all the time. And those are the skills you can apply. Going back to what you said with Joe Burrow and all these situations, I have used the running to calm myself and to not think of the finish line, which is when you're at 20 miles and you're miserable. It sounds like 6 miles is so little. It's just 6 miles, man. You've done a 10K before, but in the moment, every step hurts. I'm miserable. I'm puking. I feel terrible. I want to be done now. I want to be on a couch eating ice cream now. What the hell was I thinking doing this race? I am not a superhuman. Like literally, it's the same way that a friend of mine, David Goggins, will say, I don't want to be out there running in the rain, in the cold at 4:30 a.m. But the fact that I don't want to do it is why I'm doing it. Because that's where the real training hits. The moments where it becomes hard is where you learn who you really are. When I'm sitting here talking about running, it's easy. Oh yeah, it's fun. I want to get to the moments where I'm in the deepest, darkest place and I'm asking myself, questioning, why am I doing this? Don't want to do it, and I still persevere. That's where you become stronger. It's where you tear the muscle and grow it back stronger. And those skills have allowed me, when I'm in those pressured moments and that ultras are like something I stand on, where I'm completely calm and I'm very aligned and I'm not going to panic. So the people around me see how calm I am and I can still keep them within my control.
What you're doing is so stress packed, almost on purpose.
Right.
You're going in front of this crowd that's like big professional athletes, like all these celebrities, and you're going to like walk in and impress them and do something that's just unbelievable.
Right.
Is there thrill out of the fact that you know going into that you're going to be calm and people will see that not only will you perform, but for you, this is what you do. Do you seek these moments out because that is empowering for you?
Man, if we got like into a therapy session of like Freudian, I keep taking big swings at things that I don't know if they're necessarily going to work. But I think that the audience can sense the danger, the risk.
Yes.
That's what's exciting. And so you can feel the excitement through the camera. It's what captures you. Because I don't know, I can't explain it. It's the audience can know internally that this might have gone wrong and it didn't. And that's why you get the big reactions.
So I've done a couple of live speaking engagements, just telling stories to crowds. And I remember I told my production team as we were getting ready to put it together, like, how do you want it to go? How much production value do you want? And I said, I was like, I need the first time I do speaking engagements to be basically just me and a microphone. I want it to be a pure experience because I need to prove to myself that like, I can deliver something that's really engaging without any props, without anything, just me.
Right.
And it was like the sense of, I almost hated myself for doing this because you're setting yourself up, right? I'm going to walk out in front of thousands of people, me and a microphone. I've never done this before.
Right.
It could go horribly wrong. But it's like, I almost felt like the only way to do it was like full send commitment, like commitment to the bit.
You have to.
And I'd go out on stage, and with that sense of commitment, I was able to easily do these shows.
Yeah.
And I think for you, what I see in all these clips of you just like blowing people away, honestly, more than the bit, it is this sense that you are completely committed. And even if it goes wrong, it's like somehow he's going to spin this.
Right.
He's got full command of the room.
People love when it goes wrong. So there's that level of why are those traffic jams where you're like, why was there such a traffic jam? The rubbernecking, right? The human instinct that's in our DNA of liking to gossip and liking to see what's going on with them. Oh, look at that car. Holy crap, right? Everyone does it. We're all slowed down. We're on the frickin' BQE, and what just happened? Why is, like I-78 is jammed up because one jerk was texting.
Yeah.
And we have to watch that. So that same approach is, again, hardwired in our DNA. So in my show, I'm very keenly aware of moments where I can create stress, confusion, or light chaos. And I can make it so that you forget the things I want you to forget. And then I put the camera on the things I want you to remember. And during the moment where you're recounting what happened, I'm telling the story that you're going to remember in your mind. People don't realize that memory is malleable. So we think of his memory as the same thing as this camera shooting me right now, that we could rewind, play back, and it's immutable. It never changes. It's on camera, right? It's not. People remember certain things, and they are typically related to emotion. So I'll give you a great example. Eyewitness testimony, which you know more than anyone, is inherently unreliable because when people's cortisol levels, adrenaline, they're in a moment where they just saw the shit go down, their body floods with these emotions and all of these things that they're not used to encountering. For most people, they're not into those situations that are high stress, and now suddenly a face, a color of hair, a height, all of that stuff that's captured in 1 or 2 seconds can be changed, especially if you're interrogated later and asked questions and the investigator uses leading language, right? So when you saw this guy who was like 6'2", 6'3", I see? Well, I kind of maybe, right? You can start to change what they have, right? Imagine you do a watercolor painting and it's not dry yet. I can start to change what you painted. I'm narrating the story that you will tell the next person about me. And I will get rid of the parts I don't want, just like an editor clips sections out. And I have it so your memory only remembers the things I want you to tell or the story you tell, because the story you tell about me is what continues. It's what makes me memorable. And anyone that ever walks into a room and is the most memorable person in the room will achieve their goals the most effectively. Just think about it in your head. When you've gone to a party or an event and you've met someone, there's always at an event when you go home and you're talking to your wife or you're talking like, man, did you meet that guy? Yeah, was he? There's always a person who stands out.
Sure.
If it's a good party. Otherwise it sucks for the like everyone's boring. But what made that person interesting? Now, I think in a lot of instances, it's the fact that the person who's very interesting isn't a big talker, but they're very interested and they bring out the best in you. And you feel like, man, they were so interested in me and they give good stories. They ask me questions I'd never been asked before. And that kind of elevates a certain level in you where you get excited to be around them. Some people have a natural charisma and you analyze what is a natural charisma? What is it that they do when they walk in the room? They approach with confidence. They typically approach not a direct thing. So another thing that is very important, body posture, body positioning, and how you walk up to somebody you don't know instantly puts you at ease or makes you feel ill at ease and like they're intruding your space. If somebody walks up to you too close, whoa, bro, you know, what are you doing? Chill out. If somebody approaches you quickly and they're talking and they're not slowing down and you don't know when they're going to leave, then you start getting this feeling of, oh God, am I stuck in this conversation for a while? Versus, and I learned this doing restaurants when I was a kid, if I walk up to you at an angle and it looks like I'm 1 foot in, 1 foot out, and you're seeing one of my eyes, which is again, the way animals react instead of head on, which scares them, but at a sideways. And if I give you a time constraint, which is, oh, great to meet you. And for me, performing magic, people might not want me there. They don't know who I am, especially at a restaurant where you're having dinner and you're like, who is this kid? And I was 14 and do I have to tip him? Oh my God, do I have any cash on me? All of these things go through your mind. So I have to take away those layers of resistance. And I learned early on what I could do in those moments that applies to everything in life. It's not just about the performance, it's life skills. And I think those life skills translate very effectively into habits for success, no matter what you do.
It seems like you are, I mean, to simplify, extremely perceptive about other people. Like you're picking up cues that maybe to you seem like they could be picked up by a lot of people, but your ability, at least the way you're describing it, to read people really, really quickly is astounding. And I'll say on a much smaller level, I actually did, when I was in the SEAL teams, I did a lot of the speaking with locals. Basically, we'd be on target, and then at the end of whatever conflict we were in, there'd be an opportunity to speak to people that were in whatever village we were in Afghanistan. And truthfully, you're basically talking to the men, and you're trying to discern if they were just shooting at you or they weren't. And it's really hard to tell. And a lot of times, even with the interpreter, a conversation's not going to get you there.
No.
You're really just trying to gauge how they view me.
Intuition and instinct go a long way, right? If you have a gut feeling, you have to trust it. Then try to verify it. But if you get that gut feeling and you ignore it, like, you know, that like tickling of like, this doesn't feel right. I'm sure in your situation, that's life or death.
Yeah, I mean, this was like relatively safe, you know, so we're safe at this point. But a lot of times I would pick up very quickly if someone was just positioning themselves in a sort of adversarial way. Like, I'm sure, I'm speaking to the guy who knows this stuff, but there's a way you stand if you're almost sort of seeking a level of conflict with the person you're with. If you're deferential, you're sort of positioning yourself in such a way. But if I'm coming into the room, I'm decked out in like special operations gear, we've just secured the target, and I'm talking to you, And if you're going to stand toe to toe with me
Right.
and like look me square in the eyes, pretty much immediately I'm like, well, this is a combatant.
Right.
You know, whereas other people, maybe they're scared or whatever, but it usually comes off very quickly. And then the conversation, to be honest, it wound up being like irrelevant. It's the first like 3 seconds that I'm with somebody. And so for you, I mean, I have no idea if that relates, but are you like reading people and that's basically your tell? Or are you constantly evaluating people, whether it's during a performance or not, like in your life?
Yes.
Are you constantly evaluating? Like, how does that work for you?
So thankfully the stakes are much lower for me. So I don't ever want to put myself on the category of a Navy SEAL defending our country. It's like what I'm doing is entertaining people.
Sure.
And the skills don't generalize. So the next part is people just say, well, if you're this good, why aren't you just winning millions of dollars playing poker?
Oh,
why aren't you like catching, killers? So it's because, again, this is under the guise of entertainment and the skills don't generalize. Very clear cut. Guessing, I'll give a great example. I'm gonna do this in a moment. But if I were to ask at the table and we're playing poker, just look at why the cards right, because I have a series of things that I do, procedures to narrow the options down and figure out what you thought of that involve me being in charge.
Interesting.
Watch this. Let's just play a fun game. Okay. Picture now a card trick. Right now, if I had a deck of cards, and I don't even have one, I could probably get one out of a bag, and you don't have a deck of cards.
A deck of cards.
Right? You've never seen a deck of cards today, have you?
No.
No. So when I was a magician, we'd have to have a deck of cards right now, and I would do the old pick one card, and you'd put it back, and I'd find it. Right. But I don't have a deck of cards, so let's just pantomime this, because mentalism is about thoughts. I give you an invisible deck.
Okay, got it.
You mix them up, John. Shuffle them up. Let's see the skills. Okay. And now you take those cards, and I want you to do this. I want you to spread them out in front of you. And spreading them out in front of you means you can see all 52.
Yep.
And you can make a conscious decision, which some people would say later, well, he somehow influenced you. He used certain words, maybe used certain hand gestures. Something was already planted in your mind so that you would do my bidding.
Okay.
So I want to make this even more impossible. Take the cards and close them up again. Give one more shuffle just to be safe. I love it. And now you're going to spread them face down, which means you can't see them.
All right.
Which means that right now, if I told you to reach down and pick any card, there's no way that you could be influenced because you don't even know which one it is now. I want you to slowly reach down and maybe go to grab one and go, nah, doesn't feel right. And you maybe jump to another one next to it or this one and just grab one card at random. Now, before you turn over, you grab it out.
Okay.
And in agreement, it's absolutely impossible that I could know what you just picked because it's not real. It's an invisible card that you haven't even turned over yet. You don't even know what it is.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So you drop the rest of the cards away, gone. And now something happens that's interesting. You turn the card over, you look at it.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
Hold it up, and I want you to picture that card right there. Can you see it?
Yep.
Now watch. I didn't influence this in any way, did I? This is your own choice. 100%.
100%.
And I say to you, hearts, diamonds, clubs, spades, there's all the four suits. There's the high cards, the low cards, all of these different cards. And you had said earlier, blackjack, poker, look at that card. Imagine what it looks like. Imagine the Jack, Queen, and King have more ink because they're very full. They've painted them. Versus, for example, a 2 only has the 2 hearts, and they go all the way through. And you know what you did? You decided, because poker, on the back of the box, Ace of Spades is the card in your hand, isn't it?
Yeah. What the hell, dude? That's crazy. Yeah, it's the Ace of Spades.
Ace of Spades.
Yeah. It's
An invisible deck of cards didn't exist. So that, I know it seems...
That's crazy.
Thank you.
I changed my mind like 4 times.
I could tell you did. I saw that, the shifting and the changing, and you're like, I might go with a different, you were thinking of a different spade, but you said, no, I'm going to go back. That has to do with...
Dude, that's crazy. That's crazy. I was actively trying to subvert you. That's
so
crazy.
I can't do that at a poker table because I can't just tell the guy in front of me, look at your 2 cards before we get the river, look at me, do this, do that. They're going to be like, screw you, dude, I'm not doing any of this. Get out of my face. Put on the sunglasses, rock and roll. So in my performance, I'm the director. I get to call the shots.
Wow.
So it doesn't unfortunately work with everything. If it did, it'd be amazing. But to answer your question, I'm not living my life in like brrr mode of like, whoop, that guy. I always think of it as in the Bourne Identity.
Oh yeah.
When he loses memory and he's in that diner and he doesn't know who he is yet. Yeah. And he's like, and he tells the guy next to him, why do I know that guy's 255 and can fight? Why do I know this? Why do I know that right now I know the 4 license plates of the cars when I walked in? Why do I know all this stuff? And he's starting to dawn on him. He's like a secret spy agent. Yeah. Badass. So I think it's likened to that where when I turn it on, I'm hyper focused on what I do and my mission at hand. And the analyzing people very quickly is very, very similar to what you did, except it's done for under the context of entertainment, which is when I'm in a crowd, I'm looking around to see who I think will be great for my next trick when I'm performing. This person right now. And if you ask me, why was he so good? People will come up to me at the end of the show and go, why didn't you pick me? And I go, no offense to you. I just, for whatever reason, and it's the intangible, it's the 30 years of training, you just weren't as good as them right now. I thought they would deliver the best reaction and they would mesh with what I wanted. Now in certain rooms, I can't pick the person. You're on TV with 3 hosts, you got to use those 3 hosts. You make the best of a situation. But when I have people to choose from, and if you see me at like a live show, that's very exciting. And the fact that you like throw frisbees, we pick people randomly. If we're in like an arena, we shoot t-shirts to like the 8th row. Who's got it? Stand up, please. And how could I know who'd catch the t-shirt? How could I know who'd catch a frisbee? How could you know any of this stuff? Then I work with those people. And that's what really makes it real because, that's anyone. This is some drunk jerk who's like 8 rows in, who's, barely conscious. How in the world did you guess the name of his first crush?
I'm still sort of in shock that you just did. So I'm like thinking through how are you doing this? I realize that there's more to it than like here's how you, I was pretty good at the reason I was the guy that did a lot of the questioning of the people on site is because I had decent perception. I was pretty good at figuring out who likely had more information, and it would like lead to weapons caches and whatever. So it was just like basically I was successful enough that I kept doing it. So I was pretty perceptive. But like,
I think you still are.
Well, thank you. But it's like to be able to break down beyond a gut feeling to like specifics is just where we've talked about this thing that you do and you're making it out. You're very humble about it. Like, you can learn how to do it, whatever it is. But like, no, you can't.
I had to. Like, again, I wasn't Spider-Man, bitten by a spider and radioactive and like I changed. It's been trial and error. It's been iteration. And the same thing that has allowed me to go run 153 miles, that like, how you have children. We were talking about right when I walked in, we had a couple minutes. I came here from the airport talking about our kids, and you want to instill a work ethic in your kids. It's very interesting because being a parent, I think, is my most important job. And I'm assuming that's my immortality. It's like, who are they going to be? Because as soon as you have kids, you start to feel like, I'm going to die one day and this is my future and their future. And it's like, it really, no greater joy in life. But how do I instill a work ethic in them? Because my kids aren't going to grow up the same as me. And I'm feeling, I don't know what your beginnings were. Mine were very humble where I had to work really hard. And I was like age 16, I was supporting myself, which I don't wish upon my kids. They'll never know what that means. But I lived on my own and I had to pay for college and I had to find an apartment and like nobody paid for this stuff. So I had to figure life out early, which at the time I felt kind of pissed because I'm like, all these other kids are going on vacation. They have a car, their parents. I don't have any of that. But now in hindsight, that set me up for success in a huge way. And it made it so I didn't have a safety net. So I had to become the safety net. And I think that there's a level of that toughness you have to either create in yourself, if it's not, and a lot of people are going to have it because a lot of people listening to this are, hustling and they might not have any of these things. So I think that deciding on a goal and not giving up it's so much more important than almost natural talent, skill, anything is persistence. And you saying like, oh, I can't do this. There shouldn't be that word in your vocabulary.
You said something going back to your Spartathlon experience that actually really struck a chord with me. And I'll give you a quick story that I think relates, and I think that it plays into what you just said. So when you did not finish your Spartathlon race, you came back and you obviously did it and you successfully completed this.
It ate me alive.
Are you kidding
me? It killed me.
But you said something to the effect of, when I went into that second attempt, I was prepared to basically die in order to complete this race. So for me, I've had exactly that experience one time, and it changed my life afterwards. When I was in SEAL training, everyone thinks the hard part is at the beginning of training. The famous sort of like hell week, and you're running around on the beach and you're beat down and you're tired. That's bad. Not the hardest part. The hardest part comes about halfway through training. It's a 6-month-long course. Halfway through, you're in the underwater phase. And by this point, statistically, virtually everybody in your class is going to graduate, despite the difficulty of this test. It's the moment you all are literally forced to have this moment. And it's horrifying. There's this test called pool competency. They tell you it's just this. You just go in with your scuba tanks and, the instructors are going to come down there. You're in the 9-foot section of the pool and you're like crawling around and they're going to come down and just kind of screw with you. And you're going to follow procedures that you're taught to basically, after they finish tumbling you around and turning your air off, you go back on your knees and they're watching you the whole time and you follow these steps. You reach back, you turn on your air, you check your J valve, you check your straps, make sure it's a 3-finger loop here, you check your weight belt. I can still do it now, but it's a procedure that no matter what happens to you underwater, you reset, you follow the procedure. But each problem that they give you, whether it's tying a knot in your hose or whatever it is, gets progressively harder to fix. All fixable problems for 20 minutes. And so each time someone's come down on you, first of all, as they're attacking you, you have to go into the fetal position and just wait. You're not getting air. They're tumbling you around. So you're going about 60 seconds to 90 seconds with no air. And then you need to follow the procedure. So you can see you become more and more hypercapnic.
Right.
You're not breathing. And it's this test of staying calm and following the procedures despite literally being on the precipice of passing out.
Right.
People call it simulated drowning, this test, and you get 4 attempts at it. And so and one of the things you got to do is you got to stay calm. And so I went in and I'm doing the test, failed it miserably 4 times in a row. Wasn't even close. Was not even close. Like, I actually was the guy that they had to put a pink piece of tape around my ankle, and it wasn't even to humiliate me. I would get so panicked, I would push off the bottom of the pool and go to the surface, but we're breathing mixed gas. And if you do that, you can risk rupturing your lungs with air bubbles. And so you have to be you have to go up at a certain speed. And so there's like standby divers there to keep me from panicking and rocketing to the surface. And so I failed 4 times in a row. And as a result, I actually got rolled out of the class I was in. The class I was with, all my buddies, and they're like, look, we're going to give you one more shot. You're going to leave this class, go to the next class, and you can try again with that class. And so I go to the next class.
That sets you back 6 months?
It actually was just a couple months. They let me start in second phase. But so I go into the next class. And the thing is the students in this class, they've been through the Hell Week and everything, and they know I'm a rollback. And I sort of took on the role of like, I'm going to be a mentor. Like, yeah, I obviously failed pool competence. We're all going to take it here soon. But I really tried hard to be like a mentor. Like, here's what I experienced. I obviously failed it, but let me give you all the insights I can possibly give you. And everyone's looking at me like, oh, John's got it. Like, he failed, but he's going to be fine. And so we get to test day, and I failed the first 2 attempts, not out of panic, out of procedural problems. And so I fail on Friday, there's 2 more attempts left, and it's on that Monday. And if I don't pass them, not only will it humiliate me, but I'm dropped from SEAL training. That weekend was horrible because I'm thinking about this test. On Monday morning, I got to the pool deck, and I was so nervous all weekend. And I'm sitting on the pool deck. They make you sit with your back to the pool, and they made me go last that day. And I'm hearing the instructors like ripping kids' hoses. You're like air bubbling up off the pool. Kids are like passing out like red line, and medics running over. It's chaos. And you're just sitting there waiting for your turn. And then when it was my turn, I just had this mental shift occur where I was like, holy shit, I'm going to fucking die in that pool before I fail this test. And I got in the water, and it was like calm comes over me. And I begin this test, and it didn't matter how long I went without air. It didn't matter what the problem was. I had fully committed to this concept of I will literally die before I fail this test. And I passed, and it was so easy. And it showed me that like there's a point where you can convince yourself that your mind can sort of override all the discomfort, and you can basically do whatever you want. And you described when you went and did the Spartathlon the second time, that feeling of, I will die before I don't finish this race.
100%.
And sure enough, you did it. And so do you think that's something everybody can achieve, that level of I will go full send no matter what? Because I think for you, clearly, you put yourself in pressure situations and you just go for it. Like, I feel like maybe that's something that we have that others don't, or do you think that anyone can tap into that?
That's such a tough question because it's so hard to speak for other people and where mental toughness comes from. And I think you build it up over time. I don't think you're born with it at all. And it's those failures that reinforce later. Had you gotten it on the first try, where would you be today? Isn't that a funny question to ask yourself? Would you still be this person? So when I came back the second time, I had this guy who I saw at mile, like, I don't remember what mile it was. I DNF'd at 78. But it was this bald dude. I think he was like from Eastern Europe. And he's wearing this thing, and we're in the middle of the night, and I'm a wreck. I'm a wreck, bro. Like, just been puking maybe 100 times. And now I'm writing my DNF speech, which in the parlance of ultra marathoning is did not finish. They don't write a time next to your name. They write DNF, which is so embarrassing and just kills you. And so I've already written my speech, what I'm going to tell my wife when I went to Greece and spent all this money, and my friends who were like, dude, how'd you do on that race? And you got to eat it and tell everyone, well, you got to have that story of like, I'm going to learn from this experience and I'm going to come back stronger. Like all that bullshit that no, you should have finished. And so I see this guy and I'm already talking all this stuff like, oh man, I don't have it today. We're at an aid station together, middle of the night. We haven't slept all night. And this guy looks at me, he doesn't really understand English, and his eyes, he's these crazy eyes where they're open. I'll never forget it. He looked at me and he goes, if you cannot run, you walk. If you cannot walk, you crawl, but you never stop. Like a psycho, like a zombie apocalypse. And in the moment, I couldn't digest it, right? I couldn't take that and bottle it up and shoot it into my vein. But slowly after I left, it haunted me.
Yeah.
Because this guy, like what he had in his eyes is what I need to have the next year. And so that like slowly worked into my DNA. And when I got there, I was you on that attempt. When I started, there was no doubt. There's no doubt.
Yep.
I am finishing this thing no matter what. And when the voice enters my head that says you aren't finishing, what are you talking about? You don't exist. Gone. We go right back to the mindset. I'm hardened steel, titanium, where I'm finishing no matter what. And if that means I'm walking the next 24 hours, puking with a splint on my leg, I'm finishing this race because now this is life or death.
That's incredible. Yeah, it's funny. I rarely meet people that have had a comparable experience to what I described with pool comp, but it's so clear, like for you, this is like a defining moment. And so if people understand that in their own lives, that if your thing is, oh man, I really want to start a business. Oh man, I really want to run a Spartathlon or be a SEAL or whatever it is, whatever someone's goal is, however big or small. If the stakes were as big as they could possibly be, you could do it.
Right.
Or you could die trying. That's the level of commitment that some people need to understand goes into success. It's a compounding effect.
Right.
As soon as I became a SEAL, it showed me that I now have the capacity to set big goals and achieve them. Not be someone who claims to want to do things, but then write the DNF story of why I never actually did it.
Right. And that knowledge, that exactly what you said, the knowledge that you did it now changes the way your mind is wired. Because now you go, oh my God, what else could I do? And now if I set my mind to it, you start to believe in yourself in a certain way. And that becomes self-fulfilling. So I think for whatever people do, again, if it's inspirational messaging, like my book is designed to be motivational, but it's designed to be action oriented. Like I want to teach people.
Actually, I'll hold it up while you're talking.
How to take action. So like literally the words I used, and I thought about this a lot, was proven habits for success. Because a lot of people think you're going to get this book is that I'm going to teach you magic tricks or mentalism tricks. And the real talk is you can find those elsewhere. So the book is not going to teach you tricks. I need everyone to know because they're going to buy it and be like, dude, where do you teach me what Joe Burrow, how the hell does he throw the ball? I go, I'm not going to teach you how I do the tricks, but knowing what somebody who might have control of your life, knowing when to approach your boss, what to say, and how to get the raise that you've been working for the last 2 years. What if you could do that and up your chances by 10, 20, 30, 40% of doing that and getting them to do what you want? That, to me, is worth a couple bucks. That's worth your time, which is even more valuable than the amount of money for the book to read it. And we got a lot of fun stories baked in there as well from my crazy life.
This book really captures the essence of someone who has put themselves in highly stressful situations and persevered, and they've lived a life of basically pretending that everything is a must succeed.
Yeah.
And how to basically, harness your mind. And in some ways, learn how to read other people and influence other people. But this is a very powerful, I'm going to call it a self-help book, because to me, this is like practically a Bible of how to motivate and how to be the best version of yourself. So this is an amazing book. You got to check it out. Read your mind.
Your fellow Navy SEAL, David Goggins, gave me the quote on the top, which says, learn to master the most powerful weapon, your mind, which encapsulates what the entire book is all about, which is your mind controls your success. Whatever success is defined for you, which for everyone is different. Maybe it's monetary, maybe it's romantic, maybe it's want to have kids, maybe it's like, I just want to do something I'm not doing now. And how do you get from step A to B to C? And I know that sounds so silly, but in almost every instance, other people are involved in that journey. And my whole training has been how to win over people, how to know what they're thinking, how to influence them, right? How to get rid of the fear of rejection and failure, which is a huge part of my book, which is mostly what holds people back. That is such a huge factor. And I learned that at a young age, doing like restaurant magic and all those little things I learned how to iterate and improve. I want to give you decades of the mistakes I made, but I want to distill out of them what you can do to fast track your success.
That's amazing. This is awesome.
Let me ask you a question, John. If I told you right now, okay, the book is in your hand, and I were to ask you to flip to any page you wanted, impulsive, spontaneous, in my book, any page you wanted, and look at it and then pick any word, and then I try to guess the word. On the surface, that seems crazy, right? That seems amazing.
Yeah.
But I'm watching this like somebody at home, and I want to go to the skeptic, not the normal person, but the outlier, the 1 out of 100 who goes, yo, but he wrote the book. I wrote the book. So what if I have a photographic memory? What if I know it's on every single page? And if I could see what page you're on, I could say, right, that could have happened. That's a plausible but very improbable solution. So what if instead of doing that, because this is my book,
right?
Can we just see this room? This is, for, by the way, shout out to your team. Sick. The setup here is incredible.
It is pretty good.
For this interview. Amazing. I've been to a lot of interviews, and this might take the cake.
All right.
Hundreds and hundreds of books, probably thousands.
Yeah.
So if I were to instead ask you to walk up to any one of these books, now not physically, but mentally, if I would have said, walk up to any book in this room, grab it, walk up, and I want you to flip it open to any page, to look at that page, and to go back and forth, and my eyes are closed, and stop at any word. Can you see this happening? Close your eyes, and in your mind's eye, envision that occurring. Did you just play it out?
Yep.
Okay. Open your eyes. Be honest, right? These people trust you. They've seen you for years. This isn't staged. This isn't set up. There is no conceivable way I could know what you would have done. You didn't even know what you were going to do before I asked you to.
Yeah, fair.
When people flip, some people will find a specific page that has a meaning to them. Like maybe a kid's birthday, maybe it's January 24th, so you go to 124 to be fun about it. Or some people just flip to a random page. Now watch, I watched to see the reaction. I don't think you got nostalgic. Personal reference, the page you picked, it doesn't have a meaning to you, does it?
No.
I didn't think so. I didn't see it that way. I also see it as when you just flip, you go, stop. You were quick. You felt rushed, so you rushed. I could see it. You feel a little tense. So some people would, and they would have gone longer in the book. Again, you don't have to tell me this. Do we have a marker? Do we have something we could write with?
I have a pen.
A pen? Okay, I'm going to close. Is that your pen?
It is my pen.
Okay, I'm going to close my eyes, and I want you to do this close to your body and on the palm of your hand, and make sure there's no way I could see this and there's no camera behind you. Does it write? Does the pen write?
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to close my eyes. On the palm of your hand with no camera, nothing behind you, write as big as you can what page number you went to in the book. When you're done, blow on it, put it close to your chest. Nobody could have seen that, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Can I open my eyes?
Yep.
My gut says, again, I'm fishing. Did I get a bite? Yes. I reel it in. I think you went with an earlier page. My gut says, because I was seeing what you would do, I think it was 2 digits. Now I ask myself, look at the smile, the laugh, I might as well say yes. So I keep going. It's so unlikely that you would have done the first 30 or 40 pages because you can't even flip the page. You open a book and you go, it's already off your thumb before I've even got to page 50. So now what feels like a number that's got like some text, but not, and I think that you would have done, right, the backward hat, couple buttons open, showing some chest hair. He's more of an odd type of guy than an even. You're not a by the book. I think you might have thought of the number, chuckled, and been like inappropriate. So you wouldn't have done 69, even though it's so funny. You did 67, didn't you? Can we see your hand? Is the number 67?
Yeah. Dude, that's insane. What? Dude, how?
Any book, any page, but any word is near infinite. I don't want you to write anything. People are going to say he's got a trick hand, he's got a trick pen. This is your stuff.
Yeah,
don't write down
legitimate.
a thing. Whatever word you saw in your mind in a book, not a real book, you imagine. Throw the pen away. I want you to count without using your fingers,
Okay.
to count the number of letters to yourself, not out loud, in the word you selected, just to yourself. Count it to yourself. Don't say it out loud at the end. Some people, right when they get it, they say it. All right. No? Maybe.
I have to double check. Hold on.
Oh, don't even say that. Now you gave so much away. The double check is always an indicator of a longer word. No one double checks a word. Open your eyes.
Okay.
No one double checks a word that's 5 letters or less. No one. So now we know it's longer. Also, you probably would have done a longer word. Nobody does and, the, he, she, if.
No.
Under this level of pressure, no way. We're balling, baby. I think he did a longer word. I think this place, it's got this ambiance of like gravity. And you know, some of these books are probably hundreds of years old. Okay, think of the word. You counted twice. Most people, when they count the second time, they realize they got it wrong, and they realize, oh crap, I counted wrong the first time, and you did that. But they usually count longer and then shorter, and that's what you did. And my gut says you were like, no, it's not. You thought it was 9, but it's actually 8 letters, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's what happened in your mind. That's not even. And imagine that you write down the word. You're not going to write a thing. Okay. I want this to be all in your mind. You write down 8 letters, like hangman.
Yep.
You reach over, and you just go back and forth, and you don't know why, but you stop on one letter and you circle that one letter. You circle one letter somewhere in the word. Did you do it? In the word is how I cue you. When I say that, almost nobody does the first letter. The first letter will give away the rest of the word for a lot of people. And then also in makes it feel like it should be in between. You didn't do the first letter, did you? No, see, I was trying to guide you. And then a lot of people will avoid the vowels because we know there's vowels. You didn't do a vowel, did you? So again, we're going down that path. And now you jump back and forth. You're like, do I do this one? And my gut said you were about to do a letter, but and you jumped over the letter you're thinking of. No, I don't think it's not in the word more than once, is it?
It is.
It is, right? It is because you jump between the two of them.
Yeah.
And what's weird is the first letter you were about to circle, but you didn't. You were going to do a T, and you didn't. You're thinking of an S, aren't you?
Yes.
Swear to them. There's no setup here. This is not staged.
If you wrote this is going to
literally, we have a book, a room with hundreds of books, thousands of books. You imagine in your mind picking one up, opening it up, and going to any word. Close your eyes. Can you cover them with your hand, please? I want to show them at home because people will say later that I changed what I wrote somehow.
All right.
His eyes are covered. Can we see this from any camera or no? Have we seen one? Open your eyes. What are you picturing in your mind? You flipped an invisible book to page 67. You saw hundreds of words. You stopped. One of them jumped out at you. What was that word?
Chastise.
Chastise.
What the hell, dude? That's such a random word. That's crazy. This is not staged. This is crazy. That's crazy. I picked that because that's the most bizarre word I could think of. That's crazy, man. I don't even know what to say. I'm like looking at other people. Like I don't even know what I'm supposed to do. That is, I got to be honest. I don't even know what to say. I'm shocked. I knew you probably would be able to do this, but this is not set up. But he walked in, and within 2 minutes we were filming. This is. I'm blown away.
Create memorable moments that people take and the stories they tell. And you could chastise me, but you got a story that's going to live in your brain for a while. That's my goal. Is I just put a splinter in your brain.
Oh my
that you're going to try to
God.
pick out for years and be like, how did he know? And I wasn't even going to do page 67. I did that at the last minute. I changed.
That is so wild. What was like your first time doing this? Like your first big moment of big trick with a big audience, and you nailed it.
So I think certain things in life can't be bought, but have to be earned.
Sure.
The same way when you're in SEALs training, there's no check you can write to get that, right? So certain things in life you really have to earn. And so when I did that show, America's Got Talent, I never expected to go as far as I did. I was truly, this isn't like, this false humility. Every round I was in, I gave it my all, and I didn't think what I'm going to do next. It's just like when I hear wide receivers who at tight ends, when they say, what do you focus on when the ball gets thrown your way? Catching it. You do not think of what you're going to do after you catch the ball or you drop the ball. And so my mindset every single time was this, I'm going to just do everything I can in this round, kill it. And that's it. I never saw, and then, there was no and then, which I think is a powerful thing to do, because as soon as you start thinking and then, you start getting hung up and you drop the ball. So where do I go with this? Every round, at the end of it, it was the highs and lows were insane. Because the highs were like, I just made it through. The lows were like, oh crap, I didn't plan what I'm going to do next round, which might be in a week or two. It's got to be better than this. So it was like these two mixed emotions. So when I got to the finale, this was like the heyday of the show in linear TV, which now people are like, TV, where do I watch TV? Online? This is when like 15 million people would tune in live. Radio City Music Hall, live. That means I am on a stage, Radio City Music, there's 6,000 people in the audience, and this is airing to everyone live, which means if you screw up, ain't no safety net. You don't get caught. You don't go, cut. It's not going right. So if chastise isn't the word, if you didn't think of the letter S, if none of those things happened, I can't get out of it.
Oh
so
my gosh.
finale,
That's intense.
that was one of those moments that was life-changing.
Yeah, I believe it.
Yeah.
I believe it. So you've accomplished so much, and you clearly are somebody that is taking big swings, like you've said. Do you have any sort of like bucket list life items that still are like, I really want to accomplish that at some point?
It's funny you think that because I think I'm just starting. So like in my mind, I'm so forward facing, and it's something I tell myself on a regular basis to like live in the moment, because it's always like, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? And that's a problem in life, because when you do earn certain things or have like pinch me moments, I have pinch me moments where I'm like in the room with Steven Spielberg or LeBron, and like you just have this moment of like, dude, just think back to you 20 years ago. If you could go in a time machine, meet yourself, like Marty McFly, and be like, you're not going to believe what you're going to do in 10 years or 20 years. But there's a lot of things. Having my own series, I'm so excited about that. That's been years and years and years in the making, of having not just all these clips that you see, but a show that you get to see who I am, not just what I do.
Right.
So you get a feeling for like, what am I? Who am I? What makes me tick? And hopefully the book too, which is for years something I didn't feel confident to write a book, because I'm like, what story do I have to tell, man? Like, I do these cool tricks, that's awesome, but I started to really see that I think some of the things that I do in my life that are surrounding the mentalism are the actual hidden tricks and tips for success. This whole thing, mentalism, is very fresh and new. It's been around for 100+ years, but I think people are just getting this awareness of it, and it's because of the sports teams, it's because of these things, but they're starting to see like, this isn't magic. This is really cool and different, and it captivates people's imaginations. And I'm trying to elevate the field, not just for myself, but like the other people that do it. It's kind of like the rising tide lifts all ships. It's good for my industry. It's good for us. And it makes what I do like cool and innovative. And I like the fact that I'm being tied to it, where I want to be the name brand for this art. When you ask somebody in 5 years, who's your favorite mentalist? If you ask them that today, the question is, what's a mentalist? In 5 years, if I've done my job right, the instant answer to that question, you mean like O's the mentalist? Like the Google, the Kleenex, that you create the moniker and the brand because you've aligned yourself so closely with what this is that people associate you with it.
Dude, on that note, where's your book? That's amazing. We got to make sure that if you want more insights from the world's greatest mentalist, check out Read Your Mind. It's his new book by Oz Perlman. This is incredible. It has all those tips, tricks, secrets, mental hacks, you name it. You got to go check it out. Thank you so much for being on here. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, man. Thank you.
Seriously, mind blown. This is, I don't even know what this is. Chastise 67. Crazy. Thank you, Oz.
You got it.
One day in mid-December 2003, Detective Mark Kelly walked into a small kitchen inside of a home in Fort Worth, Texas. The house belonged to a potential suspect in a homicide case, and while his partner was interviewing that suspect in the other room, Kelly was poking around. And honestly, he wanted to hurry because the kitchen he was in was disgusting. There was grime all over everything, there was trash everywhere and rotting food, there were dishes stacked up practically to the ceiling. I mean, the place was a complete festering mess. Kelly could hear his partner talking in the other room as he grabbed the nearest drawer and pulled, and instantly he regretted it. Because when he opened that drawer, about a dozen cockroaches spilled out, crawling all over his hand, and so Kelly gasped and jumped back and watched as the bugs skittered away. Kelly was ultimately searching for clues here, and so far he hadn't found any. However, as he was standing there in the kitchen, revolted by what he had just seen and felt, he started to wonder if maybe the actual filth of this house, the actual griminess of this place, what if that's a clue? And as it would turn out, Kelly would be right. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please take pictures of the Follow Button's brand new car and then list their car for sale online. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around 6 p.m. on December 10th, 2003, 45-year-old Susie Wamsley unpacked Christmas decorations at her home in the city of Mansfield, Texas, alternating between removing items from boxes and explaining what they were to her 3-year-old granddaughter. Christmas had always been a big deal to Susie, and so every year she went all out. Her 46-year-old husband, Rick, had hung the lights outside last night, and now it was time for her to tackle the interior. And it was extra important to get it done early this year because their neighbors were coming over for a holiday party in just a few days. The thought gave Susie a little twinge of anxiety, and so she twirled her red hair around her finger as she watched her granddaughter inspect an ornament. Just then, Susie heard a camera shutter, and she looked up to see Rick taking a picture of the moment. He winked and told her it was a good one, before plopping down on the couch and showing their granddaughter another ornament from the box. Susie smiled. She was so happy that Rick got to have these moments with their granddaughter. When their own kids had been young, Rick had worked a lot at his accounting job. This had allowed the family to live in a big house in an exclusive neighborhood, but it had also meant that Rick missed out on a lot. He'd spent long hours at the office while Susie stayed home with their kids, Sarah and Andrew. And so it was Susie who had gotten to go to all of Sarah's cheerleading pep rallies and take Andrew on fishing trips. But now that Rick worked from home and so had more time, it was his turn now with their granddaughter. Just then, Susie heard the door open and a voice call out. Seconds later, Sarah walked into the room. Sarah first gave her little girl a big hug, then she stood and greeted Susie and Rick. But right away, Susie noticed that Sarah looked worried. Susie asked her what was up, and Sarah sort of looked down and said sort of sheepishly that she'd gotten another bill. Susie knew that the bill Sarah must be referring to was a legal bill, and it wouldn't be the last. Sarah was right in the middle of a custody battle with her ex-husband, Todd, and Susie and Rick were funding it. Which Susie was more than willing to do, because she knew Sarah was a great mom and they wanted to continue seeing their granddaughter as much as they could. But this whole mess was not the first time Sarah's problems had put a lot of stress on the family. Sarah used to be sort of a typical kid, she was an outgoing, bubbly cheerleader with lots of friends and just did typical teenage girl things. But then by the end of her teen years, she really began leaning into partying and also dating older men. At one point, towards the end of high school, Susie and Rick had even kicked her out of the house. But unfortunately, that had backfired because Sarah had moved in with her ex-husband, Todd, and gotten pregnant. And their relationship resulted in lots of mental health struggles for Sarah and also some substance abuse. But the whole family had still gotten through it, and now Sarah was 25 years old and doing much better, and they had their beautiful granddaughter. So Susie just swallowed down her own complicated feelings about Sarah's newest legal bill and just smiled at her daughter. She told her not to worry about it, she and her father would pay for it. Sarah was visibly relieved and thanked her mother and father, and then not long after that, the family decided to head out for dinner. And at that point, Susie dashed upstairs to let her other child, her 19-year-old son Andrew, know that they were leaving. Andrew still lived at home because he had been going to a community college nearby. However, when Susie got up to his room, she found it was empty. And Susie just shook her head, trying her best to suppress her bitter disappointment. But ultimately, she really wasn't surprised by his absence, because Andrew lately had been spending more and more time out of the house. Andrew had always been a pretty quiet kid, but lately he'd been getting so frustrated and mad so easily and basically fought with everybody in the family constantly. And then just this past fall, Susie had found out that her son had secretly dropped out of community college, even though she and her husband had just bought him a car for having kept up his grades. And ever since, the mood in the house had been tense, to say the least. So Andrew, probably to get away from that tense feeling, had been spending more and more time out of the house with his girlfriend Chelsea. And so Susie figured that must be where he was now, out with Chelsea, which was sort of a bummer to Susie, because he'd slipped out without saying anything to anyone, even though they had all talked about how after dinner that night, the family was going to decorate the Christmas tree, which was a family tradition, and it looked like he wouldn't be there. But there was nothing she could do, so Susie sighed, left the room, and headed downstairs. Hours later, the family was back at home after having dinner and after decorating the Christmas tree, and Rick and Susie were playing a board game with Sarah and their granddaughter. And they were having a nice time until Sarah finally stood up and announced that she was tired and needed to get her daughter off to bed. And just a few minutes after that, they had left the house, and suddenly the house felt really quiet. Susie looked around the room, which was now a Christmas wonderland after all the decorating they had done. They'd covered the stair banister and the fireplace mantle with wreaths, and the tree was all lit up and bright. There were even presents already under the tree, wrapped and ready for their kids and granddaughter. Susie took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of brownies that she had taken out of the oven just a little bit ago. They were Andrew's favorite, but Andrew was not here. Susie asked Rick if he wanted a brownie, but he didn't answer. And when she looked up, she saw that Rick was starting to doze off on the couch. So she suggested that they both just go upstairs and go to bed. But hours later, Susie lay in bed, completely awake. She still had a million things on her mind, like other presents she still had to buy and the errand she had to run for the party with the neighbors that was coming up later that week. She tossed and turned a bit longer, but when she just could not sleep, she finally just got up and went downstairs, turned on the TV, and laid down on the couch. And sure enough, not long after laying down and suddenly being surrounded by the sparkle of Christmas lights, Susie felt tired and finally drifted off to sleep. Around 24 hours later, at 11:40 p.m. on December 11th, a 911 operator sat at their post in the Mansfield police station. They were nearing the end of their shift, so they were tired and bleary-eyed. But they snapped back into focus when a call came in. They picked it up and clearly announced themselves, but there was no answer from the caller. However, this wasn't really unusual to the operator. Calls like this are referred to as silent calls and are often an accident or a prank. But a caller who doesn't say anything could also be in danger and may be unable to speak. So the operator followed protocol and looked up the phone number the call was being made from and was able to get an address, 820 Turnberry Drive, Mansfield, Texas. And as soon as the operator had that location, they sent a message to the officers on duty requesting that somebody go to the scene and just make sure everything was okay. Just 4 minutes later, 3 officers pulled up to 820 Turnberry Drive, and they didn't need to do much investigating to see that they were clearly in a wealthy part of town. This was an exclusive neighborhood called Walnut Estates, and the street was lined with all these big, beautiful houses, and number 820 was no exception. It was a sprawling 2-story brick home that was clearly getting a jump on Christmas because it was already covered in holiday lights. However, those lights were currently off, and the house was dark. It was close to midnight, so the officers guessed the homeowners must have accidentally dialed the emergency line and not known it, and then gone to sleep, not realizing what they had done. Regardless, the officers got out of their cruiser and went to the front door to knock and ring the doorbell. And when nobody answered, they went around the side of the house and began to look in the windows, but they couldn't see much, and they also couldn't hear any movement coming from inside. And this did put them a bit on edge, because somebody had to have been home in order to call 911 a few minutes ago, and whoever it was, even if it was by mistake, now wasn't answering. So the officers decided they did need to get inside this house, because now they were thinking, it was possible that somebody could be injured and maybe unable to respond. When they tried the front door, they found it was locked, so they walked around to look for a way in, and they saw the attached garage door was open. So they opened it up, stepped inside, and called out. Nobody answered, so they kept walking into the house. And as they kept walking into the house, they began to hear this low-pitched electronic droning sound. The officers shined their flashlights through the dark and followed the sound into the kitchen. And there, on the counter, was the source of that droning sound. It was the receiver of a landline phone that had been left off its hook. At this point, the officers drew their weapons. They didn't know what was going on, but it felt suspicious enough that they should be on guard. As they made their way out of the kitchen, they moved quickly and quietly, because they really weren't sure what was waiting for them in the rest of the house. But even with their guards up, they were not ready for the scene they stumbled onto in the living room. At first glance, even in the dark, it was clear this room was destroyed. And then as their eyes began to adjust, they saw the room was also covered with blood. There were huge pools of it soaked through the carpet in front of the fireplace, and lamps and furniture had been overturned and spattered with more blood. And then one of the police officer's flashlight beams landed on the couch. And there, under a blanket that was also soaked with blood, was the body of a woman. For a second, none of the officers said anything. Then, another officer shined his flashlight around the room in a slow circle until the light fell on the body of a man, lying face down only a few feet away. 2 victims, both almost certainly dead. The officers called for backup. Not long after that backup call went out, the detective on call for the Mansfield Police Department, Ralph Standifer, stood in the front yard of 820 Turnberry Drive, staring up at the home. All the lights were on inside, and uniformed officers had pulled crime scene tape around the perimeter. Outside, flashing police and ambulance lights lit up the street as crime scene techs geared up to begin their job. Standifer rubbed his eyes. He'd been with the department for almost 20 years, but it was still hard to get used to being woken up from a deep sleep by his pager. He was there with another detective, Mark Kelly. They'd already been briefed on the situation. The home was owned by a couple in their 40s named Rick and Susie Wamsley, and they both appeared to have been shot to death. Now, Standifer hadn't even stepped foot in the house yet, but he already knew there was a lot about this case that didn't make sense. Officers had gone to the scene because of a 911 call that came in less than an hour ago, but it didn't seem like Rick or Susie had made that call. Judging by the state of their bodies, they'd been dead for a lot longer than that. Standifer assumed, this meant that the killer must have made the 911 call, either because they lingered in the home after killing them and then made the call, or they left the scene and then returned at some point to make that 911 call. Standifer knew that, it was possible that somebody else, who was not the killer, could have anonymously made the call after discovering the bodies, but that felt far-fetched. Like, why would that person not stay and at least give more information to police? And so Standifer was hoping that once he got inside and looked around, things would make more sense. Standifer and Kelly walked up to the home and pulled plastic booties over their shoes before entering. Once inside, they split up. Kelly went through each room taking video, while Standifer just did a walkthrough of the entire crime scene. Standifer first stopped to examine the front door, and he didn't see anything that indicated it had been forced open. And as he walked through the home, he didn't notice any other doors or windows that showed evidence of forced entry either. However, that was where the killer's smoothness ended. The whole scene was an incredible mess. There was a ton of bloody shoe prints all over the place. There were some bloody fingerprints on the wallpaper in the dining room. There was a knife blade that was missing its handle on the carpet. And then, of course, there was the living room, where it looked like an intense, bloody, horrible fight had taken place. In addition to the overturned furniture, there was also a lot of blood splatter and splotches that indicated whoever was bleeding had fallen multiple times. But despite the mess, there wasn't anything obviously missing. The TV was still there were still wrapped presents under the tree, and there weren't any open drawers or closets, which you would have expected if somebody was here looking for something to steal. So Standifer did not think this was a robbery gone wrong. He turned to look at the couch where the woman still lay under the blanket. This was Susie Wamsley. She'd been shot in the head, but her blanket had been pulled up and her expression was almost peaceful, which suggested she might have died while she was still asleep. But this didn't track with the rest of her wounds, because whoever had shot her had apparently also stabbed her repeatedly in the neck and torso. It was clear she hadn't struggled though, which suggested she likely was the first one shot. But that meant the killer stabbed her after she was already dead. It was unusual for a killer to use multiple weapons like that, but it also lined up with the rest of the very chaotic crime scene. Whoever did this was clearly frenzied and highly emotional. Standifer frowned and moved away from Susie towards his other victim, her husband, Rick Wamsley. Rick's body was shirtless, so right away, Standifer saw that he too had been attacked with multiple weapons. He was covered in slashing wounds, and he'd been shot at least once in the head. But unlike Susie, it was clear to Standifer that Rick had fought with his killer. Rick's fist was clenched tightly, and Standifer saw there were actually a few pieces of hair wrapped around Rick's fingers. And so Standifer put on some gloves, and then he knelt down and he opened up Rick's hand to find strands of dark, long hair inside of his palm. And next to Rick's hand on the carpet was a broken blue hair clip. Standifer knew this could be something major, because at least at first glance, it appeared like in Rick's final moments of life, he had managed to grab the hair of his killer and rip some of it out. And this was incredibly lucky, because it meant they would now have an actual piece of forensic evidence, this hair, to test against any suspects that they had. But the evidence was also kind of confusing, because the long hair and the feminine-looking clip suggested that Rick had been fighting with a woman. But physically, that just didn't make much sense. Rick was a big guy. He was at least 6 feet tall and at least 200 pounds, and so Standifer had a hard time imagining a typical woman alone being able to overpower him. Even a strong man might have had trouble dealing with Rick, given Rick's size. So now, as Standifer stood there looking at the hair and the blue clip, he started to wonder if, maybe there wasn't just one killer here. Maybe there were multiple killers, and that's how Rick had been overpowered. Standifer went to go find Detective Kelly. Whether it was one killer or multiple, it was clear the level of brutality at this crime scene suggested there had to have been a personal motive. And so the detectives needed to start making a list of everyone the Wamsleys were close to. It was almost 8 a.m. the following morning by the time Standifer was done at the scene. When he left the house, he saw that beyond the yellow crime scene tape, there was a crowd of neighbors and news trucks gathered to see what was going on at the Wamsleys. As Standifer walked to his patrol car, a deputy approached him and told him they'd been talking to some of these neighbors and they had some information. One person said they heard multiple gunshots around 3 a.m. yesterday morning, which was 21 hours before the 911 call came in. And another said that last night around 9 p.m., they noticed the Wamsleys had not turned on their Christmas lights, which was unusual for them. Standifer ran through this timeline in his head. If it was true that there were gunshots at 3 a.m. on December 11th, and then by 9 p.m. later that same day, the house was uncharacteristically dark and the Christmas lights were not on, well, the reason for that could be because by that time, the Wamsleys were already dead. The 911 call had come about 2.5 hours after that neighbor had noticed the Christmas lights were not on in the house. But somebody was in that house who made the 911 call, and based on this timeline, it seemed it could not have been Rick or Susie because they were dead by the time the 911 call happened. So who was in the house making that call? Standifer asked the deputies if there was anything else, and they said, yeah, there was. The neighbors had also told them that the Wamsleys had 2 adult children, Sarah and Andrew. Sarah lived in her own apartment, and the deputies had already contacted her. She was on her way to the station. But Andrew still lived with his parents, and the deputies, so far, had not been able to reach him. At this, Standifer felt himself immediately tense up. Both the Wamsleys' children needed to be looked at as suspects. It was highly likely that with the parents both dead, the kids would inherit money, and probably a lot of it, judging from the very upscale neighborhood where their parents lived. And the fact that Andrew lived with his parents, but wasn't at home and was currently unreachable, made him the much more suspicious of the 2 siblings. But just then, Standifer heard somebody yelling. He looked up to see a dark-haired young man getting out of the driver's side of a Ford Mustang. He was gesturing wildly to a police officer who had stopped the car, pointing to the home, the crime scene, and saying that that was his house. A young woman got out of the passenger side of the vehicle, and Standifer could see she and this young man both looked totally panicked. The detective hustled over to the car and asked the young man what his name was, although he was already pretty sure he knew. It was in fact Andrew Wamsley. Andrew told them that he and his girlfriend, the woman he was with, had seen a news report about 2 bodies in this neighborhood being found, and he had driven here to make sure it was not his mother and father. As he said this, Standifer's eyes immediately went to the girlfriend's hair, hoping it was dark brown, like the hair he had found inside of Rick's fist. But it was blonde. Standifer was momentarily disappointed, but he knew that the girlfriend's hair color didn't actually prove or disprove anything about Andrew himself. And so Standifer looked around at the news cameras and the crowd and decided he would wait to give Andrew any details about what had happened. And so he just told the young couple to come with him back to the station where he would explain everything. A short time later, Standifer sat across the table from Andrew inside of an interview room, watching the young man fall apart as he learned his parents were both dead. Andrew looked down at the ground as Standifer broke the news, unable to speak as tears streamed down his cheeks. Standifer waited for Andrew to calm down a little bit, but he didn't really calm down at all, and so Standifer just began asking basic questions, because it seemed like Andrew was not going to be capable of giving anything more than short, simple answers. He said that he lived with his parents, but stayed at his girlfriend, Chelsea's, most of the time. And during the period of time that police believed the couple was murdered, Andrew said that he and Chelsea played some miniature golf, they went to the movies, and then they went to a friend's house for most of the night before heading back to Chelsea's to sleep. After that, Andrew went quiet again, staring hard at the floor as his eyes welled up with more tears. To Standifer, Andrew's emotional reaction to this news seemed pretty sincere. And when Standifer looked over Andrew's hands and forearms, looking for any of the telltale cuts or bruises the killer almost certainly would have picked up while fighting with Rick, he only saw one small, shallow scratch on his hand, which realistically, Andrew could have gotten anywhere. But his emotional reaction and the lack of cuts and bruises on his body was not enough to rule Andrew out, especially if he was potentially working with somebody else. And so Standifer decided to push him a little bit, just to see how he reacted. He told Andrew that he was going to send some officers to check his car for blood, and he was also going to get Andrew's fingerprints. Then he also said he was going to have to confirm his alibi with his girlfriend and friends, and he was going to check his bank records, looking specifically for large payments that could suggest a paid hit. After that, Standifer just stood there, waiting for Andrew to get defensive or angry. But Andrew just nodded and said that all sounded fine. And so when Standifer stepped out of the interview room, he was not feeling too optimistic about Andrew as a suspect. And so when his partner, Detective Kelly, came around the corner and said Andrew's sister, Sarah, was in an interview room ready to be spoken to, Standifer was glad to hear it. The first thing Standifer noticed when he went into Sarah's interrogation room was that Sarah had long, dark hair, which was roughly the same color as the strands he had seen in Rick's hand. Now, he didn't let his excitement show. Instead, he just sat down at the table and simply asked Sarah what she had been doing on December 10th. Like her brother, Sarah was visibly devastated. But unlike Andrew, who had been barely able to talk, Sarah seemed almost like she was impatient with Standifer's questions. She rattled off her actions on the night of her parents' murder so quickly that Standifer could barely keep up with her. She said that she had gone to her parents' house around 6 p.m. and they had all gone out to dinner. They had all briefly come back to the parents' house after, and then Sarah took her daughter and went home for the night. And Sarah seemed like she might just keep on rambling, but Standifer stopped her and just said, "Look, do you know of anyone who might have wanted to hurt your parents?" And at this, Sarah's eyes widened, and she nodded furiously, like she had been waiting for this question. She leaned forward and blurted out that this was exactly what she wanted to tell him. Because 1 month ago, according to Sarah, somebody had tried to kill her and her parents. She said it happened in November. They had been driving on the highway when out of nowhere, they heard this loud banging sound. Worried it could be something to do with the car, they pulled over into a parking lot to see what had happened. That's when they found a distinct bullet hole in the rear of their car, near their gas tank. Sarah said they had reported this to police, but despite looking into it, the police never found a suspect. However, Sarah told Standifer that she always suspected her ex-husband, Todd Cleveland, was the shooter. She told the detective that she and Todd were in a custody battle over their daughter, which her parents were paying for. Todd was furious about it. Standifer sat back in his seat, trying to keep his face neutral, but he felt like a bomb had just been dropped in the middle of his case. The Wamsleys had been shot at twice over a 30-day period. Whoever had killed them was brazen and determined. The detective leaned back and folded his arms as he tried to work out what all this meant to him. On one hand, Sarah had been in the car during that first shooting, which made it very unlikely, but not impossible, that she was involved in that attempt. But she also had no real alibi for the night of her parents' murder, and had admitted she was in desperate need of money. She was also eager to talk, maybe too eager, and she had pointed the finger right at her ex, which could mean she was trying to distract Standifer from looking at her. Or it could mean she was scared, and that Todd Cleveland was the shooter and he was guilty. Luckily though, Standifer didn't have to make any decisions about her guilt or innocence on her demeanor alone. He had those strands of hair from the crime scene. So he told Sarah they would need a DNA sample from her. And Standifer had half expected her to protest, but instead, she agreed immediately. As Standifer left to get one of the evidence techs, he felt more confused than ever. Sarah had seemed like a promising suspect, but her willingness to provide DNA told Standifer she likely did not have much to hide. Standifer suddenly felt the weight of how tired he was. He'd been awake all night, and his exhaustion was making it hard to unravel this case that seemed to get murkier with every clue. The next day was December 13th. It had been 2 days since Rick and Susie Wamsley's bodies had been found, and detectives Ralph Standifer and Mark Kelly were standing around a desk at the Mansfield, Texas Police Precinct. They were going over photos, financial documents, witness statements, and the newly released autopsy results, which just confirmed a lot of what they already knew, that both Rick and Susie had been shot and stabbed, and that Rick had fought back very hard. Standifer was more sure than ever that this was a personal crime. So he and Kelly were going over all of the evidence they had on their two key suspects, the children, Sarah and Andrew Wamsley. In the last couple of days, they had learned a lot more about the Wamsleys and their children. Standifer had been right. The parents had a big estate that their kids were set to inherit. It was worth over $1.5 million. And Rick also had a large life insurance policy as well. And so this gave the siblings a very strong financial motivation for killing their parents. But all Standifer could come up with to this point was evidence that actually ruled both the kids out. They had taken Sarah Wamsley's DNA when they interviewed her, and it was not a match for the hair found at the scene, which didn't mean she wasn't somehow involved, but it meant the only real evidence Standifer had against her was her financial motive and a lack of an alibi. As for Andrew, his alibi checked out. His girlfriend, Chelsea Richardson, confirmed his story. The detectives had also contacted one of his friends, a guy named Jeremy Lavender, and he confirmed that Andrew and Chelsea were with him the night Andrew's parents were killed. Plus, Andrew's fingerprints didn't match the bloody ones that were found at the crime scene. There had also been a preliminary search of Andrew's car, and they hadn't seen any obvious blood yet, although the evidence texts were not quite finished. So, Standifer and Kelly were at the point in this case where they needed to seriously consider other suspects. And luckily, they already had somebody at the top of their list. Sarah had been sure that her ex-husband Todd was responsible for the attack on the Wamsleys that happened a month ago. Standifer had already reached out to the police of the town where the Wamsleys were shot at, and luckily, the officers there had extracted the bullet from their car door. And after testing that bullet, it showed that bullet came from the same gun that was later used to kill the Wamsleys. So, if Todd was a suspect for that attack, well, then by almost default, he had to be a suspect for the murders. So, Standifer grabbed his keys off his desk and flagged Kelly to come with him. It was time to go see Todd Cleveland. When the detectives sat down with Todd at his home, he seemed extremely agitated and sort of rattled. He said he had just heard about the murders, and he was totally stunned. He also said he knew this looked bad for him, but he was adamant he was not involved. He may have been at war with Sarah and Susie, but he liked Rick, and besides, he wasn't around the night of the 10th because he was working. He was a plumber, and he said he had a few emergency jobs that night and in the early morning too. Standifer and Kelly stayed for a bit longer, but they didn't get much more out of Todd. So eventually they left and headed back to the station, and right away they called Todd's plumbing clients to confirm his alibi. And sure enough, it all checked out. Once again, the detectives were back to square one. The following day, Standifer and Kelly drove out to the home of Andrew's girlfriend, Chelsea. They weren't there because they thought Chelsea was a suspect. Her blonde hair had pretty much ruled her out. But the detectives had decided that since they were already starting over, they may as well begin by reevaluating their first two suspects, the Wamsley's children, Andrew and Sarah. Neither sibling appeared to have been at the crime scene, but Standifer and Kelly wanted to learn more about who they were close to. Specifically, who in their lives they might have trusted enough to help them plan or even carry out a murder. When the detectives arrived at Chelsea's mother's house, where Chelsea lived, they knocked on the door, and Chelsea opened it up. And quickly, she invited the detectives inside. And as soon as they stepped in, Standifer just froze, because the house was truly a mess. Not just in disarray, but like disgusting. There was trash everywhere and grime on everything. I mean, it really looked deeply dirty and uncared for. The two detectives just looked at each other and raised their eyebrows. Over on the couch was another young woman who looked to be about Chelsea's age. When she saw the detectives, she stood up, walked over, and introduced herself as Chelsea's friend, Susanna. And over the course of their brief conversation, she told them that she had actually been staying in this house with Chelsea for quite a while. After that, Standifer asked Susanna to please give them some privacy, and she nodded and disappeared into a bedroom. At this point, Standifer sat down with Chelsea and began asking her a couple questions about the days around the murders, while his partner, Kelly, began to pace around the house. Chelsea had already confirmed Andrew's alibi once, but she seemed perfectly willing to go through it again, and nothing about her story changed. And Standifer was just wrapping things up when he heard Kelly gasp in the next room. When Kelly reappeared in the living room, he looked visibly shaken, but he said he was fine. The detectives left shortly after that, and when they got back in the car, Kelly explained why he had reacted like that in the other room. He said he had been looking through all the kitchen drawers because there had been a knife blade at the murder scene, and he wanted to see if its matching handle that was missing was in Chelsea's kitchen. But at some point when he opened up a drawer, a whole bunch of roaches crawled out. That's why he gasped. Standifer grimaced. But also, the thought of those roaches made something else click into place that had been bothering him the whole time they were at Chelsea's. He was thinking it seemed very likely somebody living in a place like that, living truly in squalor, might be eager for some money. And so as they drove back to the station, Standifer decided he needed to widen the range of people he was asking for DNA from. It clearly was not enough to get DNA just from Andrew and Sarah. That really had gone nowhere. What they needed to do was also get DNA samples from all of their friends as well. It would take almost a month to collect all the DNA samples they requested, and then the detectives had to wait another 2 months just to get the results back, which arrived on March 30th. And when the results did arrive, Standifer just sat at his desk, staring at the results in shock. Because now he realized that a major piece of the puzzle had been right in front of him the entire time. Based on these DNA results, the investigation, and also a confession, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Rick and Susie Wamsley in the early morning hours of December 11th, 2003. Just before 3 a.m. on December 11th, the killer stood outside of 820 Turnberry Drive, watching Rick and Susie's garage door slowly rise. As they waited for it to open all the way, they felt both dread and also a sense of nervous anticipation. They had been talking about killing Susie and Rick for months, and actually, they had already tried to do it once before. But now, if everything went according to plan, it was actually going to happen. Once the door was fully open, the killer slipped inside, and as they entered, they could hear the sound of footsteps right behind them, their 2 accomplices. All 3 very quietly began to creep through the home, and as they passed through the kitchen, 2 of them grabbed knives. They already had a gun with them, but they figured it didn't hurt to be as prepared as possible. The house was completely silent. It was obvious both Rick and Susie were asleep. The killer was eager to get started, because in their mind, Rick and Susie had more money and a better life than they deserved, and it just was not fair. The killer had nothing, and so killing Rick and Susie would not only feel good, but it would be the answer to all of their problems. On the other side of what they did this night was going to be a much better life. And so with the gun in hand, the killer walked down the hallway to the living room where they found Susie, asleep on the couch under a blanket. And the killer, as soon as they were standing over her, raised their gun, aimed it at Susie's head, and fired a shot. And immediately, the killer then hurried upstairs to the bedroom where Rick was, and they shot at him too. Except this time, their aim was off. Their bullets hit the doorway outside the bedroom, and as Rick jolted up, the killer fired again. This shot hit Rick in the temple, but Rick didn't fall. Instead, to the killer's horror, he ran at the killer and began to fight them. The killer struggled with Rick, and before they knew it, they both were in the living room where Rick managed to force the killer to drop the gun. At this point, one of the 2 accomplices tried to get Rick off the killer, but while Rick was being pulled away, he managed to grab the killer's hair and ripped some of their hair out of their head, along with their hair clip. When Rick then tried to turn and run for the front door, the other accomplice grabbed the gun from the ground and shot Rick in the back, which caused him to finally collapse. But he still wasn't dead, and he looked up at the killer and the accomplices to ask why they were doing this. But the 3 of them just stared at Rick in shock. They hadn't realized how hard it was going to be to kill someone. And so now they were actually wondering if just shooting Susie once was actually enough to kill her. And so instead of talking to Rick, the killer and one of the accomplices began simultaneously stabbing Rick and Susie over and over again until they both were for sure dead. The trio then fled the home, and the primary killer spent the rest of the night totally excited about the good fortune that would almost certainly befall them once the bodies were discovered. But after that whole day passed, the next 20 or so hours passed, there still had been no indication that anybody knew Rick and Susie were dead. And this was a problem for the killer and their accomplices, because the sooner the bodies were found, the sooner they would get access to the money that they had killed for. So, just before midnight, they returned to the crime scene, picked up the landline phone, and dialed 911. Then, without saying anything, they placed the phone receiver on the counter and fled the house for a second time. When Detective Standifer got the DNA test results back from the hair that had been found at the crime scene, it told him exactly who had attacked Rick. But the hair didn't actually match any of his suspects. It belonged to someone that they actually hadn't even interviewed. The hair was a match for Susanna Toldano, the same Susanna who was a friend of Andrew's girlfriend, Chelsea, who was present at her house the day they went to go re-interview her. It would turn out Susanna was the one who had fired at Rick and Susie's car back in November. And on the night of the actual murders, It was Susanna who shot Susie and fought Rick. She was the primary killer. Susanna did this because she needed money, and she had actually been promised a large chunk of it by her accomplices, Andrew and Chelsea. It was Andrew and Chelsea's idea to murder Susie and Rick. Andrew was furious with his parents because they had cut him off financially after they found out he'd secretly dropped out of college. He was also in love with Chelsea, who didn't have a lot of money, and she lived with a single mother who had to work multiple jobs to barely keep their family afloat. And so the plan was made to murder the parents for money. But it was ultimately Susanna who pulled the trigger. Susanna, Chelsea, and Andrew were all convicted of murder, and they were all sentenced to life in prison. As for Sarah, she had nothing to do with the murders, and she has never healed from the loss of her parents. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen podcast, as well as Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.